The first breath of winter wasn't a quiet one. It arrived like a royal announcement, with glittering frost on the hedgerows, a stiff wind that froze your wig glue, and servants frantically running about to make sure every draft was plugged before their master's nose turned red. For the rich, winter wasn't just a season, it was a performance. The goal wasn't survival, it was how elegantly one could survive. To the aristocracy of Europe, from the Tudors' smoky halls to the Victorians' brick palaces, the first frost meant one thing: time to retreat indoors and begin the annual game of who could make their house the most ridiculously cosy. Fires roared, tapestries thickened, and furs came out like soldiers in formation. It wasn't about keeping warm, that was the side effect. It was about proving that even nature had to queue for permission to touch you. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The great estates came alive in this season. Carriages rumbled through frosty courtyards, their wheels crunching over ice as servants hustled to light hundreds of hearths. The lords and ladies descended from their chilly morning chambers wrapped in enough fur to make Noah check his inventory. If you were rich enough, your hallway smelled like pine, beeswax, and smug satisfaction. If you were poor, your hallway was just outside. Inside, the architecture itself worked overtime. Thick stone walls, high ceilings, and drafty windows made heating a mansion less an act of science and more an act of prayer. Even so, the elite didn't see this as inconvenience. It was ambience. Brisk air builds character, one noblewoman might have said, while standing close enough to the fire to roast her skirts. Every flicker of flame was a badge of triumph against the cold, and a subtle reminder that only the wealthy could afford to fight winter with fire. The season also transformed the social calendar. Summer was for garden parties, winter was for glowing circles of indoor opulence. Country houses became seasonal fortresses of indulgence. Invitations flew out like snowflakes. Dinners, soirees, masquerades, hunting weekends, for those who wanted to freeze stylishly. Guests arrived layered in velvet and pride, greeted by the host's smudgiest possession, the roaring hearth. "Welcome to warmth," it said silently. "We own it." Of course, this sudden indoor migration brought its own dramas. The cold kept people closer, and that meant gossip travelled faster than heat. Dowagers whispered scandal over brandy. Young heirs composed poetry that was as overwrought as their wool stockings, and servants developed a sixth sense for who'd left the window open just a crack. Winter may have frozen the landscape, but it melted social restraint. Nothing warms a room like rumour. And speaking of rooms, every corner of the house underwent a seasonal metamorphosis. Drawing rooms got new curtains thick enough to muffle cannon fire. Carpets multiplied. Beds gained layers of fur, quilts, and sometimes entire pets. The truly fashionable elite even redecorated for the cold months, replacing light summer silks with rich damasks and velvets, as though the house itself had decided to dress for the season. Homes didn't just shelter people from the frost, they performed luxury in layers, but while the outside world turned bleak, the upper classes turned winter into their stage for romantic melancholy. Snow drifting past candlelit windows was considered the height of poetic living. Painters painted it, poets sighed about it, and pianists composed something minor in D-flat. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and everyone pretended to enjoy the existential chill, while their servants shoveled coal with tears in their eyes. If you were a guest in such a house, you would have been expected to admire everything, from the gleaming silver to the host's insistence that it's barely cold this year, while wearing 3 layers of fur. There was a strange pride in pretending the cold didn't bother you, even as your nose went numb. Comfort was for the middle class. The rich preferred to suffer with elegance. And the the smell of winter wealth. Burning wood, stewing meat, damp wool, and perfume doing its best to cover all of it. It was the scent of victory over frost, of civilization wrapped in fur and stubbornness. The wind could scream outside all it wanted. Inside there was laughter, warmth, and the faint sound of someone shouting at a servant for letting the draught in. When night fell and frost sealed the windows like lace, the world outside vanished. The rich retreated deeper into their cocoon of luxury. They ate late, talked later, and slept beneath enough blankets to suffocate an ox. The world could freeze. They would dine by the firelight, sip their brandy, and congratulate themselves on surviving another elegant evening of near hypothermia. Winter, in short, was the season that separated those who endured from those who curated. For the rich, cold was just another opportunity to prove that even nature could be outspent. And as the fire crackled and snow glittered outside, they could look upon their empire of warmth and think, if you can't stop the frost, outshine it. The fireplace, that humble invention meant to keep people from freezing to death, became, in the hands of the rich, an altar to vanity. To the poor it was a tool for survival. To the wealthy it was a statement piece, the kind of thing you stood beside not for warmth, but to look impressive while pretending to be slightly cold for dramatic effect. A roaring fire said, "I can afford to turn forest into ambience." By the 17th and 18th centuries, fireplaces had evolved from smoky stone holes into architectural art. In grand halls and drawing rooms, they were carved from marble, inlaid with gilded metalwork, and framed with the kind of sculptural flourishes that made guests forget they were staring at a hole for burning stuff. They were designed less by blacksmiths and more by artists who treated Coldest as a design accent. Some mantels were so ornate that you could stage a minor opera on top of them, and some families did. Every fireplace was a performance. Lighting one wasn't about comfort, it was about ceremony. Servants knelt, poker in hand, while their lords reclined nearby as if they had personally discovered combustion. The crackle of burning logs was the soundtrack of affluence. It whispered, "Yes, I'm toasting oak from the royal forests because I can." Even the choice of wood mattered. Beech was respectable, oak was noble, imported mahogany logs, utterly impractical but gloriously wasteful, were the equivalent of burning diamonds just to show off. Placement mattered too. A truly fashionable home didn't have one fireplace. It had dozens, each styled for a different mood. The library fire burned dignified and scholarly, suitable for stroking your chin and making remarks about the human condition. The bedroom fire glowed tenderly, a romantic flicker best enjoyed while pretending to read poetry. The dining room fire blazed bright and hot, reminding guests that even while they ate roast swan, nature was being roasted too. Of course, all this elegance came with hazards. Many an aristocrat lost half their wardrobe, and occasionally their dignity, to an overzealous flame. Long skirts met short tempers as sparks flew. Silken cuffs smouldered elegantly. It wasn't uncommon for a lady's gown to go up like festive tinder during a soiree, after which someone would remark that she was simply radiant tonight. The fashion for long trains and voluminous sleeves made fire safety a matter of wishful thinking. But then again, so did living in a house built entirely of wood. The smoke, too, had a personality. Poorer houses were choked with it, richer ones merely perfumed by it. Some mansions installed elaborate flues, ducts, and even early ventilation systems designed by overconfident inventors who swore the smoke would be carried gently away. Instead, it usually carried gently into another room, but to the rich, coughing through a haze of status was just part of the aesthetic. If your draperies didn't faintly smell of charred oak and candle wax, were you really upper class? Fireplaces also became the centre of conversation, literally. People gathered around them to gossip, negotiate, flirt and scheme, their faces glowing orange like devils in powdered wigs. The hearth wasn't just warm, it was social gravity. Important confessions, political alliances, and romantic declarations all seemed more sincere when backlit by flickering flames. It's hard to lie convincingly in daylight, but next to a fire everyone looks trustworthy. By the Victorian era, the fireplace had evolved yet again, not into something more efficient but more decorative. Mantels were cluttered with china, clocks, and oddities from the empire. Above them hung mirrors so large they could reflect your regret in stunning clarity. The fire itself became almost secondary, a polite afterthought beneath the grand display of imported nonsense. If you were rich enough, you might not even use it. You just had one. That was the point. But perhaps the most absurd symbol of excess was the servant-powered fireplace. The gentry didn't dirty their hands with ash or logs. There was always a footman of the fire, whose sole job was to keep it alive, like a priest tending an altar flame. These men worked in shifts, ensuring that not a single ember went dim, and to them the fire wasn't warmth. It was a 24-hour performance of obedience. They didn't rest, for if the fire died, so did their dignity, and sometimes their employment. In many great houses, the chimney itself became a form of social boasting. Tall, elaborate, and visible for miles, it was a literal monument to conspicuous combustion. The more chimneys, the grander the estate, a skyline of pride belching smoke like the sighs of exhausted servants. You could tell who was home by which chimney smoked the most. Some even paid masons to design decorative smoke patterns, curls and plumes meant to look artful against the winter sky, because nothing said refinement like polluting the horizon beautifully. To the upper class, a fireplace wasn't a necessity, it was a metaphor for power. It controlled light, heat, and atmosphere. It consumed endlessly without consequence. It symbolized everything they wanted the world to believe about them. Self-contained brilliance, controlled destruction, and the ability to stay warm when everyone else froze. So the next time you picture an old manor glowing with a dozen fires, remember that warmth wasn't comfort. It was competition, a burning declaration of superiority. For the rich, fire didn't just heat the room, it burned their reputation into history. And if the flames happened to warm their toes in the process, well, that was just a pleasant side effect of vanity. Every crackle of the aristocrat's fireplace, every glowing ember reflected in fine glass, came at a cost that didn't show on the marble mantelpiece. It was paid in splinters, frostbite, and the quiet wheezing of those whose job it was to keep others warm. For the upper classes, winter meant soirée, feasts, and fireside laughter. For the servants, it meant hauling, chopping, and freezing, an endless battle against a cold that didn't dare touch their masters, but made itself very comfortable in the servants' quarters. Let's start below stairs, the engine room of warmth. While the gentry debated which imported coal burned with the prettiest flame, their staff lived in perpetual motion, ensuring those fires never dimmed. The day began before sunrise. The cook lit the great kitchen ranges, the scullery maid coaxed damp kindling to life, and the footman made the long, miserable trek outdoors to the woodpile. There, in air so cold it turned breath into tiny clouds of regret, they split logs, filled baskets, and trudged back through snowdrifts, often before their employers even stirred. Servants became living thermometers. If your fingers still functioned, it was early morning. If you couldn't feel your nose, it was time for breakfast. For the upper class, the phrase "a warm welcome" meant a butler had been up since dawn, ensuring every hearth was roaring by the time guests arrived. For the butler, it meant his eyebrows were singed, his lungs full of soot, and his patience hanging by a glowing thread. Coal, that black gold of the industrial age, was the great equalizer of misery. The wealthy adored it for its steady heat. The servants despised it for its stubborn filth. They carried it up staircases, across carpets, and through ornate corridors, all while praying not to spill a single crumb of dust. A single smudge on a duchess's wall could cost a month's wages, and while the masters admired the soothing crackle of the fire, the footman who lit it was usually still coughing from the last one. Then came the ash. For every elegant blaze, there was the morning after clean-up, cold, grey and endless. The hearths had to be scraped, the grates polished, and the debris hauled away before the family came downstairs. Many servants did this with bare hands, since gloves were an expensive luxury reserved for people who didn't handle reality. Their reward for keeping the house warm? Living quarters so drafty that frost formed on the inside of the windows. There's irony, And then there's sleeping in an icebox after stoking a Duke's 20-room inferno. Some great houses employed specific fire servants, men and boys whose entire job was tending the flames throughout the day. The most unfortunate of these were the chimney sweeps. Young, small and expendable, they crawled up soot-black chimneys to scrape out blockages and sometimes never came back down. The aristocracy enjoyed their roaring fires with the same detachment one might enjoy an orchestra, blissfully unaware that the flutes were dying backstage. The sweep's soot-covered body was invisible until someone complained about the smell. Below stairs, the kitchen staff fought a different war against temperature. Their world was not cold but too hot. Between ranges, ovens and boiling pots, they lived in a perpetual sauna, while the house above sat in frosty elegance. The cooks worked in short sleeves even in January, their faces shining with heat as they prepared feasts for people wrapped in layers of fur. Upstairs, frozen champagne; downstairs, human rotisserie. And yet despite the extremes, servants were expected to move silently, gracefully, invisible, like ghosts made of frost and ash. They carried warming pans into bedrooms, filled copper hot water bottles, and heated bricks to slip beneath blankets. A good maid knew how to make a bed feel cosy before her mistress climbed in, without ever warming herself in the process. The real art of luxury was suffering discreetly. Servants also bore the brunt of their employers' eccentric heating habits. One master insisted on sleeping with the window open for the health of the soul, leaving his footman to deliver breakfast in subarctic conditions. Another demanded his bathwater be kept steaming hot through an entire novel, a feat requiring 3 servants, 4 buckets, and the stamina of an Olympic relay team. The only thing more exhausting than keeping the house warm was keeping up with the whims of those who didn't know what cold felt like. Even at night, the work didn't stop. Fires needed to be checked, damp logs replaced, embers adjusted. In mansions so large they had their own weather patterns, the servants became midnight wanderers, creeping from hearth to hearth, keeping the illusion alive that warmth was effortless. A faint glow in every room was proof that the household was not only prosperous but civilized. After all, the true mark of refinement was never feeling the temperature drop, because someone else already had. Illness was inevitable. The mix of smoke, damp, and exhaustion created a symphony of coughs that echoed through servants' halls. Many caught pneumonia, rheumatism, or housemaid's knee, a charmingly named affliction for chronic pain caused by scrubbing floors beside icy hearths. But in an era where servants were as replaceable as firewood, their suffering rarely warranted notice. The masters might complain of poor health after an evening chill, while the maid who tended their fire died quietly 2 floors below. And yet, despite it all, the machinery of warmth kept running. The servants' quiet endurance was what allowed the illusion of noble comfort to exist at all. Their blistered hands and sleepless nights built the glowing image of aristocratic ease, one poker stroke at a time. So the next time you imagine a grand winter evening, velvet gowns shimmering by the fire, laughter rising with the smoke, remember that warmth was borrowed. It was the heat of someone else's labour, radiating through walls that divided comfort from exhaustion. Because in the grand theatre of winter luxury, the rich basked in applause, but it was the servants who kept the lights and the fires on, and if 1 or 2 of them caught pneumonia along the way, well, that was just another service rendered. In the long freezing sweep of history, no rivalry burned quite like the great fuel race, a centuries-long battle fought not with swords or cannons, but with logs, lumps, and smoke. For the wealthy, heat wasn't merely about temperature, it was about identity. How your fire smelled, how it glowed, and even how loudly it crackled announced your place in the social hierarchy. To burn something common was unthinkable. To burn something rare was civilization. Once upon a medieval winter, the upper class warmed themselves with wood, and not just any wood. Oak was the gold standard, ash was respectable, and anything soft, smoky, or, heaven forbid, damp was considered practically barbaric. A nobleman wouldn't be caught dead using pine unless it was imported and came with a receipt long enough to make peasants weep. Entire estates managed their forests not for conservation, but for bragging rights. Some families even kept genealogies of trees. This oak warmed my grandfather's gouty knees, as if forestry were a family lineage. Then coal arrived, swaggering into the scene like a smoky revolution. It promised hotter fires, longer burns, and a delightful ability to stain everything it touched. The rich embraced it cautiously at first, since it smelled suspiciously like industry and poor people. But soon, the allure of its efficiency was irresistible. By the 18th century, London's elite were heating their drawing rooms with coal that had travelled farther than some of their ancestors ever would. The irony: the city began to look like a chimney sweep's nightmare. Grey skies, black walls, and the unmistakable perfume of progress. Of course, the source of your coal mattered as much as the coal itself. Newcastle coal burned hotter than Welsh coal, and that difference was worth bragging about over sherry. Imported coal from the colonies, absurdly expensive and only marginally better, became the fuel of choice for people whose fireplaces were more for display than function. "Oh, this little blaze," a duchess might murmur. "Just a bit of Jamaican coal. The servants insist it burns sweeter." Sweet wasn't the word her neighbours would have used. But the point was made. Her chimney smelled of conquest. Before coal took over entirely, peat held its own in the fuel hierarchy, especially in Scotland, Ireland, and the moorlands. Peat fires burned with a rich, earthy scent that clung to clothes like ancient gossip. To the rural poor, peat meant survival. To the upper class, it was rustic charm, the kind of authenticity that smelled better when burned in a house with marble floors. Some estates even imported peat from their own lands just to appear connected to tradition. It was the aristocratic version of buying organic. By the Georgian period, fireplaces were no longer just fires, they were olfactory theatres. Guests didn't just admire the warmth, they commented on the aroma. A musky coal fire whispered modern, a resinous pine fire shouted continental, a slow, earthy peat burn sighed ancestral. Scent became the unseen servant of prestige. Whole rooms were designed around it, drawing rooms with ventilation ducts to carry the fragrance just far enough that visitors could inhale your wealth without coughing on it. But behind every refined blaze was chaos. Coal had to be mined, wood harvested, peat cut and dried, a logistics network powered by human exhaustion. In mining towns, soot settled on everything, including the miner's lungs. In rural forests, trees vanished faster than inheritances. Europe's great houses weren't just consuming fuel, they were devouring landscapes. Deforestation was rampant in parts of France and England, not because peasants needed to cook, but because the rich wanted their parlour fires to look picturesque. Nothing says privilege like complaining about cold while burning the ecosystem that caused it. As cities expanded, fuel became a kind of urban currency. Coal merchants thrived, delivery boys grew sootier, and bribery flourished, not in politics but in chimney maintenance. A well-connected household could ensure premium coal deliveries during shortages. Others, less fortunate, got low-grade dust that barely sparked. The difference was immediate. One home glowed amber, the other sulked in grey fumes. It was an age or so when your social rank could literally be smelled. And what of the smoke? It became the new skyline. Entire towns turned into grey watercolour paintings. Chimneys puffed like proud little towers of ego, each one proclaiming, "Someone warm lives here." The richer the district, the thicker the haze. It was said you could find your way to an aristocrat's manor just by following the densest cloud. The irony, of course, was that inside those same homes, people developed fashionable coughs that doctors called winter throats, and servants called smog lungs. Fuel also entered the realm of art. Writers waxed poetic about crackling embers and the noble oak flame. Poets adored the metaphor of fire, warmth as love, smoke as longing, ash as memory. Painters captured hearths as glowing hearts of domestic virtue. Nobody mentioned that those glowing hearts often filled half the city with respiratory issues. But beauty, as the elite often demonstrated, was most impressive when someone else paid the price for it. By the Victorian age, heating had become a full-scale class performance. The middle class, desperate to imitate the upper crust, invested in cheaper coals and efficient stoves, horrifying innovations to those who equated inefficiency with elegance. To be truly wealthy meant burning more than you needed. If the room was warm enough to wilt the flowers, you were doing it right. The air outside could choke an ox. Excellent, it meant business was booming. The economy and the environment were, for the first time, equally on fire, and so the great fuel race raged on, not for warmth, but for reputation. The fire that glowed in an earl's library was the same fire that blackened a miner's lungs. The perfume of imported wood was the scent of forest disappearing over the horizon. Yet to the privileged, it was simply comfort, the crackle of dominance, the fragrance of control, because in a world where everything could freeze, warmth was power, and nothing made power smell sweeter than the smoke that proved you could afford to waste it. When the world froze over, the rich didn't just survive, they performed survival. Winter was never merely cold, it was an opportunity to turn freezing into fashion. Every icy gust became a runway cue, every snowflake a dramatic spotlight. The goal was to stay warm, yes, but more importantly, to look like you weren't trying to stay warm. Because nothing said wealth, like pretending you weren't cold while wearing a dead animal the size of a sofa. Before central heating, the aristocracy dressed not by the weather forecast, but by the ego forecast. A noble woman stepping out in winter looked less like a person, and more like an upholstered carriage. Layer upon layer wrapped her. Petticoats, chemises, corsets, overskirts, cloaks, muffs, hoods, and enough lace to choke a bishop. Getting dressed for dinner could take hours and involve so many buttons that one began to wonder if modesty was just a form of cardio. Yet beneath all that finery, the cold still found its way in. Silk stockings froze like ribbons of glass. Shoes, dainty works of art, were about as practical as wearing iced pastry on your feet. A stroll through the garden meant sinking into frost while pretending the experience was refreshing. Nobility might have claimed resilience, but their toes quietly declared mutiny. Fur was the ultimate symbol of warmth and wealth, the soft, shimmering promise that someone else's coat had been sacrificed for your comfort. Ermine, sable, mink, and fox became the armour of winter luxury. The higher your rank, the rarer your fur. Monarchs practically drowned in it. Queen Elizabeth I once wore a gown so layered with ermine, it reportedly took 4 servants just to move her chair. It wasn't fashion, it was taxidermy with ambition. But fur wasn't only practical, it was political. It announced where you stood in the social food chain. The peasants wore wool, the middle class wore fox or rabbit. The upper class wore whatever looked like it might once have guarded a sacred mountain. Entire trade routes formed to feed this winter vanity. Russian sable travelled across continents, Persian lamb through deserts. Also a duke's shoulders could glisten, while his servants shivered in the doorway. And then there were the winter accessories, those delicate bits of nonsense designed to make people believe frostbite could be chic. Fans carved from ivory, muffs lined with exotic pelts. Gloves so thin they could barely stop a breeze, but embroidered so lavishly they could stop conversation. A true aristocrat didn't just fight the cold, they accessorized it. The muff alone was a symbol of both refinement and ridiculousness, essentially a portable pillow for your hands, often so enormous it could double as small luggage. Men, of course, were no less absurd. The Georgian gentleman, for example, faced winter armed with breeches so tight that circulation was optional, a waistcoat designed for display, and a coat that looked dashing but weighed as much as a small anvil. Their hats, vast, plumed, and perilously unstable, caught the wind like sails, ensuring that walking outdoors was as much a test of balance as bravery. If fashion was pain, Georgian winter fashion was hypothermic performance art. By the 18th century, The layering game had evolved into a science of suffering. The secret wasn't just quantity but sequence. Linen closest to the skin to absorb sweat and regret, wool for insulation, silk for luxury, and fur for show. The result? A look that said, "I'm warm, but also I can't bend my arms." Every corridor, carriage, and ballroom became a theatre of slow, careful movement. Not out of grace, but because collapsing under the weight of your wardrobe wasn't elegant. And let's not forget the winter wigs, grand, powdered constructions that defied both physics and temperature. They didn't keep the head warm so much as trap air, dust, and occasionally wildlife. But they looked magnificent in candlelight, and that was all that mattered. The richer you were, the more elaborate your wig became, ensuring that if the cold didn't kill you, the hairspray equivalent of whale fat eventually might. For outdoor appearances, capes and cloaks reigned supreme. The wealthy wore heavy velvet lined with fur, so large they trailed majestically behind them, or inconveniently collected snow. In Paris and London alike, winter promenades were less about fresh air and more about fashion endurance trials. Ladies fainted in carriages, gentlemen sweated through their lace cravats, but as long as they looked regal while doing it, the season was a success. Of course, all this extravagance came at a price beyond the tailor's bill. Hygiene, those many layers trapped everything: warmth, odour, and the general aroma of society's unwashed ambition. Laundry days were monumental operations. Garments was too precious to wash often, so perfume stepped in. By January, the scent of the elite could be described as a bouquet of roses, mothballs, and mild despair. As time marched toward the Victorian era, the obsession with cold weather refinement only deepened. Bustles expanded, corsets stiffened, and cloaks grew more theatrical. Winter ballrooms glittered with jewels that refracted candlelight like ice, a perfect metaphor for the season. Breathtaking, brilliant, and absolutely freezing. Meanwhile, the servants tasked with dressing their masters developed the patience of saints and the posture of mules. What made it all remarkable was how little of this was actually about warmth. The aristocracy had mastered the art of pretending that physical comfort was for lesser beings. Shivering was elegant, practicality was vulgar. A duchess would rather perish gracefully than wear something sensible. Winter didn't just test their endurance, it tested their pride. So when you picture a grand lady wrapped in silver silk or a gentleman striding through snow in velvet and fur, remember they weren't just dressing for the freeze, they were dressing to defy it, to prove that fashion could outlast frostbite. Because in the world of the rich, survival was never the point. Looking spectacular while slowly turning blue, now that was style. There are layers. And then there were historical layers, the kind that transformed human beings into heavily wrapped monuments to discomfort. For the rich, layering wasn't merely about keeping warm. It was a social sport, a kind of fabric-based arms race, where the goal wasn't insulation from the cold, it was insulation from the perception of poverty. The more layers you wore, the less human you appeared, and the more aristocratic you became. In the grand wardrobes of the past, dressing for winter wasn't a task. It was a full-body negotiation with physics. Take the chemise, that humble first layer. Made of fine linen, it was the foundation of all things, the polite barrier between your expensive garments and the unfortunate reality of your body. It absorbed sweat, oil, and secrets. Over it came the stays or corset, because why breathe freely when you can look socially acceptable? The corset was winter's cruelest paradox. It trapped warmth, yes, but also any possibility of exhaling naturally. If your ribs weren't audibly complaining, you were underdressed. Then came the petticoats. Not one, but several, each designed to give shape, volume, and a faint sense of claustrophobia. The wealthy piled them on until they could barely fit through doorways. Underneath it all, you were warm, but by the time you sat down, the air circulation was so poor that the lower half of your body could have hosted a mild ecosystem. Add stockings, garters, and layers of underskirts, and you weren't so much a person as an architectural feat. But this was only the beginning. Over the corset came the bodice, Over the bodice came the gown, and over that came a robe or mantua, depending on the sentry's mood for discomfort. Each one was heavy, brocaded, embroidered, and utterly designed for display rather than survival. A woman dressed in all her winter finery could weigh as much as a small mule and move just as gracefully. Sitting required strategy. Walking was an act of faith. For men, the story wasn't much simpler. The gentlemen of the Georgian and Victorian ages approached layering with the same reckless enthusiasm as their female counterparts. Shirts, waistcoats, cravats, coats, overcoats, greatcoats. It was less getting dressed and more assembling armour. They might stride into a ballroom looking dignified, but under all that tailoring lay a man 1 degree away from spontaneous combustion. And heaven help anyone who sneezed in full formal wear. Rebuttoning alone could take until Easter. Every layer was a message. A chemise of fine silk whispered refinement. A wool petticoat hinted at sensible wealth. Velvet cloaks screamed indulgence. The order of dressing became almost ritualistic, a quiet sermon on the virtues of excess. Servants, those long-suffering saints of the wardrobe, memorized the sequence like a liturgy, and dressing their masters could take hours, with pauses for breath, balance, and the occasional fainting episode. But layering wasn't only about showing off. It was about protection from judgment. The cold could be conquered, but scandal was harder to thaw. Appear in too few garments, and you risked whispers of impropriety. Appear in too many, and you were mocked for ostentation. Somewhere between hypothermia and heatstroke lay the perfect level of elegance. And so every morning became a gamble. How many layers make one look dignified rather than delirious? The Victorians in particular turned layering into a moral statement. A proper woman was expected to be covered from neck to ankle, with modesty measured in textile square footage. Even gloves were layered, silk beneath kid leather, ensuring that no raw skin dared meet the world. The only thing thinner than the fabric was the oxygen supply beneath it. It was said that a lady's pulse was slower in winter, not from the cold, but from her corset politely rearranging her lungs. And the accessories. Each layer demanded its entourage. A gown required a shawl, which required a brooch, which required a muff, which required yet another servant to carry the muff when it inevitably became too heavy. Cloaks draped over shoulders like curtains, hoods framed powdered hair that had taken hours to construct, and veils fluttered dramatically even indoors. The result was less warm, human, and more extensively wrapped secret. Of course, once you were layered to perfection, mobility became negotiable. Going out required strategy. You couldn't simply walk, you had to glide, pivot, or be gently escorted like an overloaded ship leaving port. Staircases became perilous. Doorways required sideways negotiation. If a woman needed to turn suddenly, it often required planning, prayer, and the assistance of at least one footman. And heaven forbid you dropped something. Retrieving it was an act of public humiliation and physics. The absurdity didn't stop at land. Even carriages had to be redesigned to accommodate the sheer volume of clothing. Interiors were lined with fur and velvet, while passengers were wedged inside like overstuffed upholstery. By the time they reached their destination, the air inside was thick enough to be sliced and served as pudding. And still, etiquette required composure. Emerge from the carriage, smile faintly, and pretend your corset hasn't fused with your spine. The rich, of course, turned all this inconvenience into theatre. Fashion journals detailed the latest methods of layering, with sketches that made their readers gasp and tailors curse. Parisian warmth, they called it, an art form that involved looking effortlessly poised while slowly asphyxiating. Women fainted elegantly, men perspired heroically. Suffering had never looked so symmetrical. And so winter layering became the ultimate contradiction. A battle between the need to live and the need to impress. The aristocracy didn't just want to survive the cold, they wanted to dominate it, even if it meant collapsing halfway through supper. Because in an age where appearances ruled everything, warmth was optional, but aesthetic suffocation was mandatory. And if dinner went cold while you were getting dressed, well, that's what servants and reheating were for. Nightfall in a preheated world was a declaration of war, and the battlefield was the bedroom. Once the grand halls had quieted, the fires burned low and the servants finally stopped tripping over logs. The upper classes retreated to their private fortresses of warmth, rooms so thick with drapery, fur and superstition that stepping inside felt like entering an upholstered dream. Sleep was no simple act of rest. It was a nightly campaign against frost, draughts, and mortality. For the rich, the bed was not just a place to lie down, it was a monument to survival. Great canopied structures dominated their chambers, towering with carved oak, embroidered hangings, and enough layers of blankets to smother a small orchestra. Curtains were drawn around the bed not for privacy, but for insulation, a mini-climate system powered entirely by fabric. Once enclosed, it became a velvet womb of dubious air quality, but undeniable prestige. If your bed didn't creak under the weight of 5 quilts and 2 live dogs, you were clearly new money. Bedding materials themselves were a matter of status. The lower orders had straw or horsehair. The elite slept on feathers, sometimes goose, sometimes swan. Occasionally rumours suggested exotic birds, though this mostly meant whoever could afford the shipping. Featherbeds were luxurious, yes, but also unpredictable. They absorbed moisture, smelled faintly of livestock, and were known to explode into a blizzard if overfluffed. Still, waking up to a face full of feathers was considered preferable to waking up frozen to the headboard. Above the mattress came the blanket hierarchy: linen sheets for the skin, wool for warmth, and fur for triumph. Ermine and fox were the most coveted, though wealthy eccentrics sometimes commissioned entire patchwork bedspreads made from marten, sable, or bear. The result was a scene that looked part royal comfort, part hunting accident. Beneath all that luxury, the human body was reduced to a faint breathing shape. It was less sleeping person, a more softly wheezing taxidermy exhibit. And yet, even with such extravagance, the cold found its way in. Houses were enormous, walls were stone, and insulation was mostly wishful thinking. Drafts sneaked through keyholes like ghostly pickpockets. To combat this, the rich employed ingenious sleeping strategies. Bed socks and nightcaps were standard, the latter often so long they could double as scarves. Some wore quilted bedgowns or night wrappers, which made them resemble sentient pastries. Married couples often slept separately, not because of marital frost, but because sharing a bed in winter meant sharing body heat, breath, and most horrifyingly snoring. Then there were the tools of the trade: warming pans, brass contraptions filled with glowing embers and slid between sheets minutes before bedtime. In the right hands it meant toasty comfort, in the wrong hands spontaneous combustion. Maids raced from room to room armed with these deadly frisbees, occasionally leaving behind scorched patches as evidence of their devotion. Later innovations included stoneware or copper hot water bottles. Affectionately known as bed pigs, the 18th century equivalent of cuddling a very hot, very judgmental pet. For the truly paranoid about cold, there were bed tents, small canopies that enclosed only the sleeper's head, keeping breath warm and air moist. They looked ridiculous, but worked remarkably well. Writers and nobles swore by them, claiming they could sleep through blizzards. Others preferred to keep their noses outside the covers, leading to what doctors politely termed morning frost nose, essentially waking up with your face frozen to your pillowcase. Beauty sleep indeed. No detail of the wealthy bedroom was left to chance. The floor was layered with thick carpets and fur rugs, so that bare feet never met reality. Bed steps were sometimes wrapped in fabric so no one's toes dared touch the cold wood. Curtains were drawn tight not just against the wind, but against evil air, for drafts weren't merely uncomfortable, they were thought deadly. Physicians warned that a breeze in the night could bring paralysis, madness, or worse, an inconvenient case of the sniffles during social season. Lighting too became part of the nocturnal ritual. Candles glowed dimly behind glass shades. casting long shadows across the bed's draperies. The rich preferred beeswax, a sweet-smelling luxury compared to the tallow candles of the poor, which burned like despair. The flicker of flame against velvet was the very picture of comfort. Until someone knocked one over. Many a stately home was lost to a midnight combination of flammable fabrics and overconfidence. The bedtime routine itself bordered on the ceremonial. Ladies were assisted by maids who brushed their hair exactly 100 times, applied cold cream to faces that would shortly freeze anyway, and then tucked them into bed like delicate pastries in a velvet oven. Gentlemen took their nightcaps literally. A small glass of brandy to warm the soul before burying themselves under 8 layers of fabric and self-satisfaction. And still, even in this cocoon of privilege, sleep was not guaranteed. The air could be so still inside a curtained bed that breathing felt like sipping stew. Servants might stoke fires at midnight, sending fresh smoke curling through the chamber. The sounds of expansion and contractions, creaking wood, sighing curtains, settling stones, composed the lullaby of luxury. If the temperature dropped too far, there was always the desperate option of summoning a maid to bring another blanket, or, scandalously, another body. By morning the scene resembled the aftermath of battle. Sheets tangled, candles guttered, and the fire dead to ash. Servants crept in, shaking the children in their bones as they fluffed the feather mounds back into order. The masters would rise, groaning beneath the weight of survival, already preparing to tell guests how delightfully warm the night had been. The truth, that half the household froze and the other half nearly roasted, was quietly brushed under the carpet along with the stray feathers. For all its decadence, the winter bedroom was a place of fragile victory. Every night was a siege, every dawn a small triumph. Beneath the fur, the silk, and the embroidered illusion of comfort, the rich were just as human as the rest, shivering in the dark, praying the fire held, and thanking heaven for the servant who risked frostbite so their dreams could thaw. Because in the grand war against winter, the bedroom wasn't a refuge, it was a fortress, and the bed its most luxurious trench. When winter's grip tightened, and every breath looked like a failed exorcism, the wealthy didn't hide, they hosted. Dining in the cold months wasn't just about eating, it was about performing warmth. The grand table became a stage, the guests the actors, and this meal itself a declaration. We may all be freezing, but we'll do it fabulously. The scene was something between a royal banquet and a survival experiment. Picture a cavernous dining hall, its ceiling so high the heat never even visited, its walls lined with portraits of ancestors who looked equally unimpressed. In the centre, a long, gleaming table, polished to a mirror shine, set with silverware that could double as mirrors for self-admiration. Candles flickered in crystal holders, casting soft, romantic light, which did absolutely nothing to increase the temperature. The guests sat smiling politely, wrapped in layers of silk and dignity, while their breath puffed visibly over the roast. To dine in winter was to prove that civilization could conquer frost, or at least outdress it. The fire in the great hearth burned high, but mostly for show. It roasted one side of the room while leaving the other to freeze nobly. Guests seated too far from the flames resorted to subtle foot stomping under the table, while those closer risked spontaneous melting. The trick was to look composed while suffering equally. True refinement was measured by how little your teeth chattered when the soup arrived. And oh, the soup! The first line of defense in the war against hypothermia. It wasn't merely food, it was strategy. Thick, rich broths laced with wine, cream, or even egg yolks were designed to warm the insides and impress the palate. But temperature mattered. A noble soup had to steam dramatically, as if announcing wealth by evaporation. Too little steam and the host risked ridicule. Too much and the guests risked blistering their tongues. But better a burnt mouth than a cold reputation. The courses that followed were feats of endurance disguised as luxury. Game birds glazed with honey, joints of beef steaming like volcanoes. elaborate pies bursting with gravy ears so hot they threatened lawsuits. All had to be served piping, not for taste, but for theatrical effect. A cold dish in winter was social suicide. Warmth, after all, was the meal's true ingredient. If a guest's eyebrows didn't fog slightly as they ate, the evening was considered a culinary failure. Behind the spectacle, an army of servants waged their own war. Cooks worked in infernal kitchens to produce dishes that cooled the moment they reached the hallway. Footmen sprinted through icy corridors, balancing trays while dodging drafts and judgment. Timing was everything. Each dish had a lifespan of maybe 3 minutes between perfectly heated and fit for the poor. To make it on time was triumph, to serve it lukewarm was treason. The dining ritual itself was as rigid as the weather. No matter how cold etiquette forbade haste, guests ate slowly, delicately, as though frostbite were a test of manners. Forks must be held just so, napkins folded precisely, and no one dared breathe too close to their wine lest it freeze from neglect. Servants kept the fire fed, but not too much. The host had to appear generous, not desperate. Maintaining the illusion of effortless warmth required more calculation than most modern heating systems. Drinks, too, adapted to the season. Summer wine gave way to mulled wines and hot punches, thick with spices, citrus, and enough brandy to stun a horse. Glasses fogged as quickly as conversation loosened. The warmth wasn't only physical, it was social lubrication, the genteel way to set your insides aflame without alarming the clergy. Some aristocrats claimed mulled wine cured the chill, others used it to forget it existed. Either way, it was the most fashionable form of internal heating known to man. As the meal progressed, the room transformed. Candles wept wax, fires hissed, and guests' cheeks glowed like overripe fruit. The air filled with scents, roasted meat, perfume, and faintly singed wig powder. Servants fanned away smoke with silver trays while pretending not to breathe it. Conversation sparkled as much as the crystal, topics ranging from politics to the latest frost that had claimed someone's prized roses. The more the wind howled outside, the more determined the diners were to appear unaffected. Dessert brought the evening's final irony. Cold confections in a frozen season. Sorbets and iced creams imported through absurd expense and served with theatrical flourish were the ultimate brag. See, they seemed to say, we can afford to eat ice and still be warm. The guests, numb of mouth and spirit, applauded politely before reaching for another sip of something flammable. When dinner finally ended, hours later, guests rose stiffly, the women adjusting layers, the men pretending not to shiver. They drifted toward the drawing room, where brandy, cigars, and gossip awaited like loyal servants. The great table was left to smoulder under candlelight, its remains glistening with the evidence of survival. Downstairs, the servants began the grim after-party, scrubbing, washing, reheating themselves over kitchen fires that never quite stopped burning. Upstairs, the last of the guests stepped into their carriages, wrapped in furs and self-satisfaction. The wind bit their cheeks. They called it bracing. Winter dining, in the end, wasn't about nourishment at all. It was about endurance and appearances. The table was a battlefield where comfort fought ceremony and rarely won. The feast was a message to the world. We are untouched by the cold even as our fingers turn blue. Because in the grand theatre of winter luxury, food didn't just sustain life, it performed it. One steaming, frost-bitten course at a time. Long before electric bulbs tamed the night, dinner didn't begin when the sun went down. It began when someone lit enough candles to rival it. For the wealthy, dining by candlelight wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a declaration of dominance over darkness. Each flame flickering on the banquet table was another small, burning boast that said, I can afford to set fire to my income. A single grand dinner might consume 100, even thousands of candles, each made from beeswax so pure that peasants would have wept to see one burn. Beeswax was expensive, slow burning, and delightfully smug. Its clean scent separated the rich from the rest. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were strictly for the masses, smelling faintly of regret and mutton. The aristocrat's table, on the other hand, smelled like honey, perfume, and faintly singed ambition. But all that luxury came with consequences. Dining rooms, sealed against winter's chill, quickly filled with a haze of smoke thick enough to make even the roast pheasant taste earthy. Guests politely ignored the sting in their eyes as the air turned into a fog of vanity. By the time dessert arrived, the ceiling was lost behind a halo of candle soot, and the chandeliers dripped with the residue of melted wax and pride. And yet, nobody complained, because to cough was to admit you were mortal. Candles were placed everywhere, on the tables, on the mantels, in sconces on the walls, and in elaborate chandeliers that hung precariously over the heads of diners like glittering fire hazards. Servants moved constantly between them, trimming wicks, replacing candles, and praying that one wouldn't tip over into a duchess's wig. There were stories, many in fact, of flaming coiffures extinguished by panicked footmen. But even that in its way was a mark of prestige. After all, you had to be quite wealthy to accidentally set your hair on fire at dinner. The candlelight transformed everything it touched. Gilded mirrors threw back the glow like miniature suns, silver cutlery gleamed like liquid moonlight, and jewellery, oh, the jewellery, danced in the shadows like captive stars. It was flattering light too. Faces looked softer, wrinkles kinder, and wine-fueled smiles more genuine. It's no wonder people associated candlelit dinners with intimacy. The truth was less romantic. Everyone looked better when slightly blurred by smoke. Still, light meant status. The number of candles you used wasn't about necessity, it was about narrative. A modest dinner might glow beneath 50 flames, a royal feast demanded hundreds. French courts led the way in this year excess. Versailles at supper could be seen from the next province, its mirrored halls reflecting so much light that night itself seemed an optional concept. The English, ever eager to keep up, followed suit, even if their foggy air and flammable wigs made the attempt riskier than anyone liked to admit. Of course, managing all that illumination was a nightmare. Candles were fickle things, dripping, flickering, dying without warning. A single draught could send an entire chandelier into chaos. Servants stationed around the room became the invisible conductors of light, snuffing and relighting in perfect rhythm, ensuring that no aristocrat's dinner conversation was interrupted by darkness. When a candle guttered out, it wasn't simply a small inconvenience, it was a social emergency. The idea of dining in dimness was practically criminal. Then there was the wax itself, forever melting, dripping, and threatening to ruin something valuable. Tablecloths, tapestries, wigs, and even pets bore the scars of molten wax gone rogue. Some hosts hired wax catchers, small glass dishes hung beneath chandeliers to trap errant drips, essentially fire insurance disguised as decor. But in truth, no one ever fully escaped the fallout. By the end of the night, the air smelled like roast duck and singed dignity, and yet people adored it. Candlelight gave dinners a sense of theatre, flickering shadows, glowing faces, the hypnotic dance of flame. It was the original special effect, transforming dining into drama. Courtiers and guests used it to their advantage, leaning into the light just so, letting the golden glow flatter their jewels or hide their wrinkles. A clever hostess might even dim the room deliberately, knowing that soft light made her appear both mysterious and mercifully ageless. It wasn't just about seeing, though, it was about being seen. To eat under 1,000 flames was to exist in a world where light was power. Every glittering surface announced your wealth. Every shadow whispered exclusivity. The poor huddled around a single candle, eking out its glow. The rich built entire constellations indoors. The act of illumination itself became a symbol of superiority. But of course it was a fickle luxury. Candles burned quickly, servants tired, and the expense was staggering. By the time the last guest left, the air was thick enough to chew, The guests smelled faintly of smoke and perfume, and the once pristine ceilings were marked with dark smudges of soot, elegant little autographs of extravagance. Yet no one saw it as a flaw. The stains were a reminder of abundance, the visible residue of having more light than sense. Downstairs, the servants coughed their way through clean-up, scraping wax from silver and polishing away the evidence of the previous night's air quality disaster. Above them, the gentry slept soundly, dreaming of how radiant they must have looked in the glow. Candlelit feasting was the perfect metaphor for the wealthy world that created it. Dazzling, fragile, wasteful, and slightly suffocating. The light blinded everyone just enough to forget that half of it was smoke, because in those glittering rooms where wax dripped and shadows danced, dinner wasn't just eaten, it was burned into memory. And if the pheasant tasted a little like soot, well, that was simply the flavour of luxury. If you were rich in a frozen century, winter wasn't just a season, it was a banquet with icicles attached. The cold outside only encouraged greater indulgence inside. When the air turned sharp enough to saw through bone, the wealthy responded the only way they knew how, by eating like the apocalypse had RSVP'd. Their dining tables didn't merely groan under the weight of food, they protested. The winter menu was less about nourishment and more about victory, proof that you could out-eat the elements and still complain about digestion afterward. At the heart of any grand winter feast was meat, staggering quantities of it. Venison, beef, boar, swan, peacock, goose, and even the occasional unfortunate songbird made their way to the elite table. A nobleman's kitchen in January looked like Noah's Ark had capsized mid-meal prep. Venison was especially prized, not because of taste alone, but because hunting in the snow made it a sport of supreme arrogance. Nothing declared I have time and servants to waste quite like chasing deer through frost while wearing velvet. Once caught, the animals were transformed into feasts worthy of mythology. Cooks stuffed, roasted, and glazed their prey until it could no longer be identified. A culinary principle known as hide the carcass, highlight the ego. Great pies sealed with pastry armour were the centrepiece of the table, filled with rich gravies and secret mixtures of spices imported from distant lands. These pies weren't delicate confections, they were edible fortresses, requiring knives, teamwork, and a bit of faith to open. When one was cut, steam poured out like an exorcism, carrying the scent of wealth and faint cholesterol. And yet the true symbol of cold weather indulgence wasn't the meat, but the pastry. Winter was the season of pies, puddings and tarts, the sweet and savoury cousins of hibernation. The aristocracy adored anything that could trap warmth and flavour in a flaky shell. Mince pies filled with dried fruits, sugared nuts, and generous amounts of brandy were practically currency during the season. Christmas pudding was less dessert and more endurance test, steamed for hours until it reached the density of an asteroid, then drowned in flaming liquor because, well, nothing said holiday spirit like dessert on fire. Spices were the jewels of winter dining. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, pepper, luxuries once worth their weight in silver. To eat them was to travel the world without leaving the table. The smell of cloves and roast meat mingled with perfume and wax, turning dining halls into sensory avalanches. Even vegetables, when they appeared, were disguised with spice, cream, or wine, until they no longer resembled anything that had once grown from soil. Carrots were candied, turnips were buttered into submission, and cabbage was politely escorted off the menu. And the wine, oceans of it. The winter table practically floated on fermented grapes, red for the meats, white for the fish, and mulled for everything else. Wine was heated with sugar, citrus, and spice until it became the 18th century equivalent of central heating. Those who drank modestly were considered ill or dull. Those who didn't remember the meal were said to have dined beautifully. Champagne, though risky to transport in the cold, became a winter obsession among the upper crust. Nothing said, "I'm rich enough to freeze my bubbles," like popping corks during a snowstorm. Alcohol wasn't just accompaniment, it was a survival mechanism disguised as sophistication. The brandies, ports and sherries flowed endlessly, warming bellies and lowering inhibitions faster than the temperature could rise. Toasts were made to the host, to the season, to absent friends, and to anyone still conscious after the third course. By midnight, the guests' laughter grew louder, the arguments about poetry more passionate, and the average candle hazard exponentially higher. Fish also made its winter appearance, though mostly as a display of decadence. In frozen months, fresh fish was a logistical miracle. Carried overland in ice-packed barrels or pulled from estate ponds under cracking frost, it was served as proof that money could outwit nature. Salmon and sturgeon graced the tables of kings. Eels, slippery symbols of indulgence, slithered into pies and stews. Nothing declared power like consuming seafood miles from any coastline in the dead of winter. Sweet dishes followed, of course, because wealth, like hunger, had no natural limit. Marzipan castles, candied fruits, and sugar sculptures turned the end of the meal into an edible art gallery. Sugar itself was one of the era's great luxuries, the white gold of the empire, and was used not sparingly, but as if it grew on trees. Every bite of dessert was a display of colonial reach and dental disregard. Guests would coo over miniature sugar temples or spinning wheels of confectionery before devouring them in 3 bites. Meanwhile, servants orchestrated this symphony of excess with military precision. The kitchens below were infernos of motion, roasting spits turning, sauces boiling, knives clattering, as cooks fought to keep the upstairs illusion of effortless luxury intact. Timing was everything. One overcooked roast could undo a reputation faster than scandal. The great irony? While upstairs, diners basked in candlelit warmth. Downstairs, cooks sweated through summer-level temperatures, proving once again that comfort was a privilege best delegated. By the end of such a meal, the guests were fortified against cold and reason alike. Bellies full, cheeks glowing, they sank into drawing-room chairs to continue the ritual of digestion, gossip, and mild regret. The fire crackled, brandy glasses refilled themselves mysteriously, and the last courses of the evening, candied nuts, dried fruits, and philosophical nonsense, carried on into the small hours. The winter menu wasn't just nourishment. It was social theatre, a seasonal sport, a declaration of conquest over scarcity. Every bite was an act of defiance against the frozen world outside. While peasants gnawed on bread crusts and turnips, the rich feasted on steaming luxury, convinced that excess could thaw anything, even the laws of biology. Calories didn't count because nobody had invented them yet, and if they had, the aristocracy would have had them glazed in honey and served with cream. While the grand dining rooms glittered with candlelight and crystal, the real theatre of winter wasn't upstairs. It was below, deep in the bowels of the house, where fire wasn't a symbol of luxury but a daily torment. The kitchen was the great paradox of the cold season, a place where people worked beside roaring heat and still shivered with exhaustion. If the upper floors were a winter pageant, the kitchens were a furnace of survival, powered by sweat, smoke, and people who never got to taste what they cooked. Imagine descending the narrow servant stairwell into that subterranean world. The air grew heavier, warmer, and thicker with every step. The scent of roasting meat mingled with steam, smoke, and a lingering note of despair. It wasn't cosy, it was chaotic. Cooks barked orders, scullery-maids scoured pots blackened beyond recognition, and footmen darted through clouds of vapour with trays that might have weighed as much as they did. You didn't so much walk through a Georgian or Victorian kitchen in winter, you swam through it. The architecture itself conspired against comfort. Great houses placed their kitchens far from the dining rooms to keep the smell and noise away from delicate aristocratic noses. This meant vast stone corridors separated the two, corridors so cold that by the time a dish made the journey upstairs, it risked freezing mid-delivery. So the staff compensated. The fires downstairs blazed high and constantly, the heat bordering on infernal. It was like living inside a giant iron lung that coughed smoke. At the heart of this world stood the range, an enormous, temperamental beast of brick, iron, and endless appetite. It had to be kept alive from dawn until well past midnight. Servants shovelled in coal by the bucket, adjusted dampers, and turned spits heavy with meat until their arms went numb. The slightest mistake, a lapse in attention, a spark too wild, and disaster struck. Kitchens could go from dinner prep to house fire in seconds. There were no breaks, only brief moments to wipe the soot from your face before the next course demanded resurrection. The heat hierarchy was literal. Cooks, scullery maids, and spit boys worked closest to the fire. The front line of the culinary inferno. The scullery maids, usually the youngest and lowest ranked, laboured in the swamp of suds and steam, scrubbing endless mountains of pans so hot they could have been forged by Vulcan himself. Washing dishes was a misleading phrase. It was hand-to-hand combat with boiling water. Many emerged with raw red hands cracked from alternating heat and cold, badges of invisible endurance. Then there were the spit boys, the tragic heroes of the roasting world. Before the invention of mechanical roasting jacks, these boys spent hours manually turning spits, long iron rods laden with meat, before the fire. The job required no skill, only stamina and a questionable will to live. They were often orphans or pauper apprentices, paid next to nothing and roasted as thoroughly as the food they turned. A bad day meant a blister. A worse day meant fainting into the fire. Higher up the ladder was the cook, the general of the kitchen army. She, for it was often a she despite the later rise of male chefs, ruled with iron ladles and volcanic temper. Her kitchen was her kingdom, her tools her weapons. She had to manage timing, seasoning, servants and expectations, all while sweating through the lace on her cap. Above her, the butler and housekeeper ruled their own spheres of logistics and propriety. Between them, they kept the household functioning, a fragile ecosystem balanced between soot and silverware. The kitchen also played host to an orchestra of smells, meat dripping into hot pans, spices sizzling in wine, pastries baking to golden perfection. To modern ears, this sounds delightful. To servants breathing it for 12 hours a day, it was sensory warfare. The air was so thick with smoke and grease that every inhale felt like sipping stew. By evening, everyone's skin had a light coating of lard, and their clothes reeked of roast and coal. If you could smell like that and still curtsy properly, you had earned your station. The contrast between upstairs and downstairs couldn't have been more obscene. Upstairs, candles glowed and conversation sparkled. Downstairs, the fires glared and tempers flared. The gentry might joke about braving the chill, but below them the servants lived in the exact opposite, a climate of permanent August. Sweat trickled into shoes, the air shimmered, and even the stone walls sweated with condensation. Opening a window was out of the question. The shock of cold could shatter glass or trigger a draft that spoiled the dishes. The result was a stew of human and environmental misery. Yet somehow meals appeared upstairs with precision bordering on miracle. Dishes arrived steaming, sauces intact, and pastries uncollapsed, testaments to the servants' choreography. The butler ensured the procession moved smoothly, announcing each dish with solemn pride. No guest ever saw the near misses, the dropped platters, the panicked scrambles behind closed doors. Luxury, after all, depended on invisible labour, and invisibility was the highest skill in service. When the final course had been served and the guests upstairs drifted toward their brandy, the kitchen didn't rest. Clean-up was its own purgatory. Mountains of greasy crockery returned, pots needed scrubbing, and tomorrow's dough had to be kneaded before dawn. The fires never truly died. They merely dimmed, crackling like exhausted laughter. The servants moved slower, their faces flushed from heat and fatigue. Only then did they allow themselves a scrap of food, the remains of what they'd cooked for others, eaten standing in silence beside the same fire that had tormented them all day. And so the great houses survived winter not by magic but by the sweat of their unseen inferno. Upstairs, people toasted the season, thanking Providence for its warmth. Downstairs, people simply kept shoveling coal and praying they wouldn't collapse before pudding. In the hierarchy of the household, the cold belonged to the masters, and the heat belonged to the servants. Between them stretched the temperature of history, proof that comfort, like fire, burns brightest for those who never have to feed it. If winter dining was theatre, then etiquette was the script, and every performance had to be flawless, frostbite or not. The aristocracy prided themselves on their ability to suffer beautifully, and nowhere was that skill tested more than at the dinner table. You could be freezing, your breath visible over the soup and your hand trembling like a ghost at a séance, but heaven help you if you slurped, sneezed or clutched your spoon like a commoner. To dine among the elite was to fight both the cold and your own survival instincts. The hall might be draughty, the candles guttering, the silverware icy enough to double as medical equipment, but the rules of refinement didn't melt for anyone. It didn't matter if your teeth chattered loud enough to harmonise with the string quartet. Your posture remained upright, your tone polite, and your napkin folded into an origami swan of self-restraint. At the head of the table, the host set the tempo. A well-bred gentleman didn't just serve food, he served composure. Every movement was deliberate, every glance measured. If a servant spilled soup or the fire sputtered out mid-meal, the true sign of refinement was to pretend nothing had happened at all. Unflappable, after all, was the highest compliment a person could earn, particularly when one's nose had gone the colour of overcooked lobster. Ladies, meanwhile, faced a more delicate battle. Their gloves, a winter necessity and social must, were often removed just before dining, revealing fingers too cold to function and rings frozen in place. Yet they were expected to hold forks with effortless grace, slicing tiny portions while discussing poetry, politics, or the scandal of someone else's curtains. Every movement of the hand, every raise of the glass, had to be measured and soft, even as their limbs screamed for circulation. If they trembled, they blamed it on emotion. Etiquette manuals of the time were mercilessly optimistic about the realities of temperature. They warned against huddling near the fire, lest it appear unbecomingly desperate, and encouraged hosts to seat their guests comfortably distant from the hearth to avoid impropriety. Translation: freezing to death was preferable to looking common. Posture was paramount. Leaning forward for warmth suggested weakness. So people sat upright, necks elongated, shoulders drawn back, the human equivalent of a frozen swan. Dining rooms were architectural traps for the well-mannered. The ceilings were high to impress, the floors cold to echo, and the windows designed more for symmetry than insulation. Draughts slipped through curtains like uninvited guests, swirling beneath the tablecloths and nipping at silk stockings. Ladies hid small foot warmers beneath their skirts, discreet brass boxes filled with coals, while men relied on brandy and denial. Everyone pretended it was perfectly comfortable, even as the room's temperature dropped faster than the conversation about last week's opera. The ritual of service made things no easier. Courses arrived in strict order, each introduced by a servant whose hands were likely as cold as the plates. The food might steam briefly, promising warmth, only to cool into decorative sculpture by the time etiquette allowed a bite. Eating quickly was uncouth, but eating slowly meant consuming something halfway between cuisine and archaeology. Still no one complained, because true nobility could digest anything, including frost. Conversation was the social insulation of the table. The well-trained guest was expected to glide effortlessly from topic to topic, regardless of the icicles forming on the chandelier. Complaining about the temperature was forbidden. Instead, one commented on the bracing air or fresh atmosphere. Everyone smiled through chattering teeth, their laughter sounding suspiciously like teeth clinking. A clever host always placed the most talkative guests near the draftiest spots. Gossip, it seemed, generated its own heat. Manners extended even to the smallest gestures. Bread had to be torn, not bitten. Napkins rested in laps, not around necks. If one's nose ran, and in those conditions everyone's did, the only proper solution was a silent, graceful retreat to compose oneself, preferably somewhere with a fire and fewer witnesses. Sneezing was to be done quietly, ideally behind a fan or lace handkerchief, and only if one could do it attractively. Historians are still unsure if that was ever achieved. And then there was the silverware problem. Utensils polished to mirror perfection were often so cold they could cause mild frostbite. Guests learned to handle them delicately, a balancing act between refinement and survival. Servants sometimes pre-warmed spoons discreetly, but woe betide the butler who overheated one. A guest yelping mid-meal because their spoon seared their fingers was the height of indecorum. Better to go numb quietly. The hierarchy of seating added another layer of peril. The closer you sat to the host, the higher your social standing, but also, typically, the colder the draught. Nobles near the fire might feel smug until the smoke decided to join the meal, filling their eyes with tears and their lungs with ambience. Those near the door had the privilege of greeting every chill that wandered in, but nobody moved. To shift seats was to risk social death, and besides, one's outfit probably made turning impossible anyway. Despite all this, etiquette triumphed. Dinner ended as it began, with smiles, toasts, and an air of unflappable grace. Guests stood, bowed, and complimented the host on the delightful warmth of the evening, a phrase that translated loosely to, "I can no longer feel my extremities." The servants opened the doors to the drawing room, where fires blazed more generously, and the guests floated in like survivors emerging from a snowstorm, pretending they'd been comfortable the entire time. For the upper classes, manners were armour, and winter tested every joint in it. Politeness wasn't optional. It was the difference between being civilised and merely cold. They endured the draughts, the chill, the slow-cooling feasts, all for the sake of appearing graceful while freezing to death. Because in the grand ballet of winter dining, warmth could fail, wine could spill, and soup could congeal. But etiquette, like frostbite, was eternal. When the frost tightened its grip and even the wallpaper felt cold to the touch, the wealthy reached for their most reliable source of warmth, the bottle. Forget insulation, forget fireplaces that barely worked. Alcohol was the great equalizer between comfort and collapse. In a world without central heating, the rich invented central drinking, and they performed it with the kind of dedication that could only come from privilege and mild hypothermia. To understand the winter drinking habits of the elite is to understand their philosophy. If you can't fix the cold, you can at least blur it until it seems charming. The rich didn't sip to survive, they sipped to perform survival beautifully. And nothing encapsulated that better than the winter drinks that filled their goblets, bowls, and occasionally their regrets. The reigning monarch of cold weather comfort was mulled wine, that fragrant potion of heat, spice, and denial. Red wine was simmered with cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, sugar, and orange peel, an aroma so decadent it could make even a frostbitten ballroom smell like a bakery. It wasn't just a beverage, it was an event. Servants carried steaming jugs through glittering halls, filling goblets, while the guests' faces glowed from firelight and fermentation alike. Each sip promised warmth, each refill guaranteed it would be the last, which, historically speaking, it never was. But mulled wine was only the beginning. Enter the punch bowl, the centrepiece of social lubrication since the late 1600s. Imported sugar, exotic spices, and rums or brandies from across the empire, all swirled together in a bowl large enough to drown your dignity in. No winter gathering was complete without one. The punch bowl was democracy in liquid form. Everyone dipped their ladle, from duke to debutante, until conversation blurred and the violinist started playing off-key. Each family had its own recipe, passed down like a holy relic but adjusted for ego. Some used arak from India, others added tea or lemon, and a few eccentrics even included champagne, presumably because restraint was a gauche. These concoctions could warm you, yes, but they could also erase hours of memory, which was a fine trade-off for anyone snowed in with relatives. The English especially adored their hot punch, often served in silver or porcelain bowls so ornate they could double as baptismal fonts, and in a sense they were rebirth through brandy. For those who preferred their winter heat straight to the point, brandy was the unquestioned champion. Doctors prescribed it for nearly everything: chills, melancholy, fainting, and the existential dread of January. A glass before bed to fortify the system was considered practically medicinal. The Victorians even added it to soup for invalids, which probably explains why so many invalids were remarkably cheerful. A tot of brandy was said to restore circulation, and it did, just not evenly. Then came toddy, the simple man's miracle elevated by aristocratic flair. Made of hot water, sugar, lemon, and spirits, it was the liquid version of a good night's sleep. In stately homes, it was served in delicate glass cups with silver rims, often carried to guest bedrooms before they retired, because nothing said sleep well like a light dose of sedation. Some households even kept kettles perpetually ready for hot punch or toddy, an early prototype for the wet bar, though no one called it that because the term hydration hadn't yet been invented. And of course, port and sherry reigned supreme in drawing rooms after dinner, especially when the outside world was a snowdrift. These fortified wines, dense, sweet, and aged longer than most servants, were the ideal digestifs. Port was considered masculine, dark, brooding, and capable of dissolving an argument about politics. Sherry, meanwhile, was the gentler companion, elegant, fragrant, and deceptively potent. Together they turned cold evenings into philosophical debates no one remembered the next morning. Winter also brought about an entirely new set of rituals for drinking, because even intoxication had to follow etiquette. The punch ladle, for instance, was sacred. A long-handled silver scoop that guests passed with solemn precision, as though transferring liquid grace. To spill was a social sin. To drink too little, an insult to the host. Glasses were warm before serving lest the chill shock the wine, and by extension one's reputation. Even the order of drinks mattered. Lighter wines before heavy ones, brandy only after dessert, and hot punch whenever despair required it. Yet beneath all the ceremony, drinking was the rich person's practical solution to bad architecture. Those grand country houses with their marble halls and mile-high ceilings looked magnificent but trapped warmth about as well as a screen door. Alcohol filled the gap between what fireplaces promised and what physics allowed. A guest who had consumed sufficient mulled wine didn't care if the room was freezing. They were too busy discussing how invigorating the air felt. Of course, indulgence had its consequences. By midnight, the combination of heat, smoke, and spirits turned most gatherings into what could politely be described as uncoordinated enthusiasm. Candle flames blurred, laughter grew louder, and the line between conversation and confessional vanished. One could gauge the success of a winter feast by how many guests had mistaken a potted plant for a confidant. For all its absurdity, however, these drinks did something remarkable. They united people against the cold. The same punch bowl that dulled a countess's sensibilities also warmed her frozen heart, at least for the evening. In that heady blend of spice, sugar, and spirits lay the secret of aristocratic endurance. If you couldn't beat winter, you could at least toast it into submission. So when the snow howled outside and the walls groaned with frost, the rich didn't huddle. They poured, stirred, and raised their glasses high. The clink of crystal was both defiance and comfort, a sound that said, "Let the wind rage, we're already on fire." Because in a world before central heating, warmth didn't come from radiators. It came from reputation-proof alcohol, and the quiet hope that tomorrow's hangover would be slightly warmer than today's frost. For the rich, a winter banquet wasn't just dinner, it was public relations in pastry form. Every goose roasted, every candle lit, every icicle refracted through crystal goblets served a purpose: to remind everyone else that the host could out-eat, outspend, and outlast the season itself. The frost may have conquered the fields, but it would never conquer their reputation. Winter for the wealthy was the perfect excuse to turn survival into spectacle, a theatrical act of superiority performed in satin and smoke. The grand banquet halls of Europe were less about warmth and more about warfare, social, political, and culinary. A nobleman didn't simply host a dinner. He staged an event that could secure alliances, impress rivals, and silence gossip, all while pretending it was casual hospitality. The temperature outside might be below freezing, but the pressure inside was enough to melt marble. Imagine the scene, a dining hall vast enough to echo, with chandeliers dripping wax like golden icicles and tapestries fluttering faintly from unseen draughts. 100 candles blazed in defiance of the long night, throwing warm light over dishes that gleamed like trophies. The fire roared, servants glided, and the air shimmered with heat, perfume, and pretense. Guests arrived wrapped in furs, shivering from their carriages, only to step into a room that smelled of roasted meat, sweet wine, and smug success. For the host, every detail was political. The menu, the music, even the temperature were statements of rank and taste. To serve lukewarm food was to risk scandal. To let a guest see their breath indoors was practically treason. A good host ensured that his guests were impressed, intoxicated, and slightly intimidated. The goal wasn't comfort, it was envy. The cold, in that sense, was useful. It made the contrast sharper. The frostier the world outside, the warmer your wealth looked inside. Feasts were also seasonal propaganda, proving that abundance didn't hibernate. While common folk struggled through salted meat and turnip soup, the nobility dined on fruits from greenhouses, spices from colonies, and wines from sunlit vineyards 1,000 miles away. Oranges in January were less a delicacy and more a diplomatic announcement. I can command summer at will. Each imported dish was a small declaration of empire, and each course a subtle reminder that nature's rules didn't apply to the elite. Royal banquets took this idea to delirious extremes. Monarchs like Louis XIV, Peter the Great, and England's George IV turned dining into statecraft with gravy. The winter feast wasn't about hunger, it was about hierarchy. The guests weren't invited to eat, they were invited to witness. When Louis XIV dined before his court at Versailles, hundreds of eyes followed every bite. The Sun King didn't just consume food, he consumed attention. Even his soups had stage directions. The message was clear. If I can feast in winter, I can rule forever. In aristocratic England, the country house banquet became a seasonal weapon in the battle for influence. Invitations were both currency and ammunition. To be invited meant inclusion. To be excluded meant social frostbite. The host spared no expense. Game hunts fed the tables, musicians warmed the air, and servants practically evaporated from overwork. The cold outside was forgotten, or rather, it was flaunted. Windows frosted into lace, reminding everyone that beyond those panes lay the world they'd conquered. The decorations themselves turned propaganda into art. Halls were adorned with evergreen garlands, silver branches dusted with mock snow, and sculpted ice displays that shimmered under candlelight. Some wealthy hosts even commissioned edible architecture, sugar castles, marzipan gardens, and pies shaped like mythical beasts to display wealth in its most temporary form. These confections were both absurd and awe-inspiring, designed to be admired, whispered about, and eventually devoured, much like their creators' reputations. Behind every clink of crystal and courteous laugh, politics simmered, hotter than the soup. Guests positioned themselves by rank, allies whispered over wine, and rivals smiled through gritted teeth. Deals were struck between bites of venison. Marriages were negotiated over pudding. The fire wasn't the only thing burning. Every compliment was calculated, every toast a test. To host a winter banquet was to conduct diplomacy with cutlery, and failure could be as costly as famine. Even seating arrangements carried meaning. The host's place at the head of the table wasn't just convenient, it was symbolic. The closer you sat to them, the greater your prestige. farther down your influence cooled literally and metaphorically. The unlucky guests at the drafty end might as well have been exiled to Siberia. And yet they smiled, because etiquette demanded grace, even when one's soup had turned to slush. Winter banquets also functioned as a reassurance for the rich themselves. To eat lavishly while the countryside froze was to reaffirm the divine order, the comforting fiction that wealth was proof of worth. These events weren't mere indulgence. They were moral theatre. "Look how splendidly we dine," the message went. "It must be God's will." Never mind that the kitchens below resembled Dante's seventh circle. Upstairs, everything gleamed with divine approval and imported citrus. By midnight, the feast usually descended into glorious chaos. Music swelled, wine overflowed, wigs tilted dangerously, and someone's uncle was loudly reciting Latin. The air grew so thick with heat and perfume that guests emerged hours later, dazed, glowing and reeking faintly of roasted opulence. As they stepped back into the bitter night, snow crunching under their shoes, they turned to look at the mansion's golden windows blazing against the darkness, a floating island of impossible warmth. That was the point. The banquet wasn't about food or pleasure. It was a message to the world. A candlelit manifesto that said, "We can afford to defy nature. We can feast in famine. We are untouchable." The cold, rather than an inconvenience, became their favourite backdrop, a contrast that made their extravagance shine brighter. Because in the social winter of high society, a good host didn't just serve dinner, they served dominance, one steaming, envy-inducing course at a time. Winter for the wealthy wasn't about being warm, it was about looking warm while freezing tastefully, and nothing communicated that balance of luxury and frostbite like the fabrics they wore. The great paradox of upper-class fashion was simple. The more money you had, the colder you probably were, because when one's goal was to impress society rather than defy pneumonia, practicality was the first thing left out in the cold. Among the elite, fabric meant status, and winter was its runway. The simplest wool or linen wouldn't do. Those were for peasants, shepherds, and people who actually survived winter efficiently. The wealthy reached for the most extravagant materials imaginable. Silk that whispered of empire, velvet that drank up candlelight, and ermine, the fur of kings, that had no measurable warmth but exuded the same energy as a signed declaration of superiority. Velvet, the season's darling, was the undisputed symbol of winter wealth. Thick, soft, and ruinously expensive, it wasn't so much fabric as a lifestyle. Velvet robes, gowns, and coats shimmered in rich hues of crimson, indigo, and emerald. Each one dyed so deeply that it seemed to trap the very idea of heat inside its folds, unfortunately, only metaphorically. It clung to every draught like gossip and absorbed smoke from every candle. But when you swept into a hall wearing it, you didn't need to be warm. You were seen. Velvet was about presence, not pulse. Then came brocade, that heavy patterned silk woven with threads of gold and silver, because apparently walking in full metal armour wasn't enough of a statement. Brocade coats and gowns weighed as much as a small child and required an entire ecosystem of servants to maintain. They shimmered under firelight, giving the illusion of warmth, while the wearer's fingers turned an elegant shade of blue. But who cared about blood flow when one looked like a Renaissance painting come to life? Fur, of course, reigned supreme. It was the ultimate luxury, not because it worked, but because it cost lives, both animal and financial. The most coveted was ermine, that pristine white fur dotted with black tails, famously used to line royal robes and coronation cloaks. It didn't insulate nearly as well as beaver or fox, but it looked like authority incarnate. Monarchs swaddled themselves in it not to fight the cold, but to advertise divine right. It was less a garment and more a statement piece that whispered, "I am God's favourite mammal." Then there was sable, soft as rumour and twice as expensive. A Russian import, it was so prized that entire fortunes were traded for it. The richest nobles wore sable-lined cloaks that glowed darkly in candlelight, proof that the wearer's finances were fireproof. Fox and mink followed close behind, draped over shoulders or wrapped around necks in endless circles of vanity. The irony? The only truly warm furs, like bear or wolf, were considered too rustic. Apparently surviving was unfashionable. And what of the footwear, the final frontier of frostbite? Winter shoes for the rich were absurdly delicate. Satin slippers of polished leather, or embroidered heels that sank instantly into snow. Overshoes called pattens were sometimes worn outdoors, essentially metal stilts designed to keep the wearer's feet out of the slush. They looked ridiculous, sounded like horse hooves, and made walking as graceful as juggling eels. But again, warmth was a peasant's concern, noise and inconvenience were the marks of refinement. Accessories completed the tableau of impractical elegance. Gloves made from kid leather or silk were so thin they could barely fend off a strong glare, much less a chill. Cloaks and capes were vast and heavy, their lining worth more than a servant's yearly wage. They were clasped with jewelled brooches shaped like suns, an ironic nod to the warmth they didn't provide. Hoods were lined with fur, trimmed with lace, and large enough to double as portable tents, yet somehow still managed to let in drafts for fashion's sake. But for all the layering, the body underneath still froze. Letters, diaries and portraits all confirmed that the wealthy routinely suffered through winter ailments in their finery. Chilblains, numb fingers, and winter rheumatism were badges of social success. A duchess shivering under 2 stone of velvet was still preferable to being seen in plain wool. Better to die admired, as one cynical courtier reportedly put it, than live unnoticed in comfort. Meanwhile, the servants who maintained these luxurious fabrics faced their own trials. Keeping silk free from soot, fur brushed and aired and velvet uncreased was a daily nightmare. Fires produced sparks, candles dripped wax, and the kitchens below filled the house with smoke that clung to every thread. Wealth might have insulated reputations, but not wardrobes. Even the most resplendent ermine cloak eventually smelled faintly of dinner. Still, fashion ruled supreme, and winter only sharpened its edges. The elite treated the season as a test of endurance through excess, a chance to prove that their beauty, their fabrics, and their fortune could triumph over nature itself. Portraits from the era tell the story best. Queens posed in silken gowns beside frozen windows, lords standing proudly in snow-lined courtyards, their cloaks sweeping behind them like banners of defiance. None of them look warm, but every one of them looks victorious. In the end, the luxury fabrics of winter were less about comfort and more about hierarchy woven in thread. Every shimmer of velvet, every fleck of fur, every embroidered sleeve was a reminder that warmth, like dignity, was something the rich could afford to fake. Because in the grand parade of aristocratic fashion, survival was secondary. What mattered was that when the frost bit hardest, you could look it in the eye and say, through chattering teeth, "Yes, but at least I look magnificent." If winter made warmth a luxury, it turned jewellery into defiance. When temperatures dropped and everyone else reached for blankets, the rich reached for brilliance. They didn't want to look warm. They wanted to look immortal, even if their extremities begged to differ. In ballrooms where frost clung to the windows and draughts prowled beneath the door, jewels gleamed like bottled sunlight, proof that beauty, not body heat, was the true mark of survival. No one wore jewellery in winter because it was practical. They wore it because it glittered against pale skin like wealth refusing to die. The colder the air, the better the sparkle. Diamonds and silver shone most vividly in the firelight, refracting warmth they didn't provide, emeralds, rubies and myrrh. And sapphires seemed to pulse in the flicker of candles, turning dinner parties into frozen galaxies of ego. The trick, however, was enduring them. A diamond necklace in January was essentially a string of tiny ice cubes around your neck. Earrings were beautiful until your lobes lost circulation. Rings clamped onto cold fingers like decorative frostbite. But vanity was an excellent anaesthetic. After all, what was a little pain when you could dazzle through it? The Georgians and Victorians perfected this art of elegant suffering. At winter balls, ladies arrived draped in glittering gemstones that could have paid off a small national debt. They glimmered through breath clouds, skin goose-pimpled beneath silk gowns so thin they might as well have been theoretical. Gold filigree caught the light while the women wearing it quietly wondered if their elbows still existed. Yet these jewels weren't just for decoration, they were symbols of endurance and empire. Every gem had a story, and most of those stories involved conquest, inheritance, or scandal. Diamonds mined in India or South Africa sparkled as miniature testaments to colonial ambition. Pearls from the Persian Gulf gleamed like tears shed by overworked divers. Rubies from Burma, sapphires from Ceylon, emeralds from Colombia. Each stone carried the weight of empire, gleaming proof that the wearer's reach extended far beyond the foggy streets of London or the icy avenues of Paris. Even in portraits, nobles insisted on being painted shimmering amid imagined warmth, a glowing fire behind them, jewels catching the flame as if mocking it. Fire provided light, but jewellery provided immortality. Long after the embers died and the silk rotted, the diamonds endured. Some of those same pieces would pass through generations, cursed and coveted, still glittering centuries later, as if they remembered every frozen ballroom they had outshone. The arrangement of jewels followed strict etiquette. Diamonds were for evening wear, pearls for daytime modesty, because nothing says humility like several ocean creatures' worth of ornaments, and coloured gems for occasions requiring emotional drama. A well-born ladies' ensemble could include a tiara, necklace, earrings, bracelets, brooches, shoe buckles, and hairpins, all coordinated to catch light from every possible angle. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was spectacle. Candlelight hitting cut crystal was the 18th century version of paparazzi flash. Men too had their share of glittering delusions. Georgian and Regency gentlemen adorned themselves with jewelled snuff boxes, gold watch chains, and shoe buckles so reflective they could double as signalling mirrors. Rings with family crests, diamond-tipped tie-pins, and monde ornate cufflinks announced that their owners had far more money than restraint. Even military officers, supposedly symbols of stoic discipline, strutted through winter balls with medals and gem-studded hilts that jingled louder than the orchestra. But winter posed a unique challenge for these treasures. Metal shrank in the cold, gemstones felt like ice, and silk gloves made fastening anything a logistical nightmare. Servants were drafted into the battlefield of fashion, helping their masters fasten chokers and bracelets without accidentally amputating circulation. The results were dazzling and occasionally dangerous. More than one aristocrat fainted during a waltz not from romance, but because her corset and necklace had conspired to limit oxygen. The maintenance of jewels was another ordeal. The cold and smoke of winter balls left residue on stones that dulled their lustre. Servants polished them with vinegar, spirits, and even fine ashes. Pearls, fragile and vain, required body contact to retain their sheen, meaning the very oils of the wearer's skin gave them life. In that way, pearls were both parasitic and poetic. The colder the host, the dimmer they grew. As the evening wore on, jewels shifted from ornaments to burdens. Earrings tugged at stiff necks, tiaras pressed into scalps, and necklaces cut into goose-fleshed skin. Yet no one removed them. Suffering was half the spectacle. A duchess gleaming in diamonds might secretly be numb from the collarbones down, but at least she looked radiant doing it. In the eyes of high society, comfort was vulgar, but glitter was divine. Jewels also served as social vocabulary. The size of your gems dictated your worth, and their origin whispered your story. In an age obsessed with class, a sapphire could speak louder than a title. A well-placed brooch was both conversation starter and conversation stopper. "Oh, this old thing," a lady might say, as her guests blinked at the reflection of their own faces in her necklace. "It was my grandmother's." Translation: I have more ancestors than you have savings. By the time the last waltz played and the carriages lined up outside, the fires burned low and the jewels shone even brighter, defiant little stars outlasting the night. Guests stumbled into the cold, cloaks wrapped tight, their ornaments gleaming one final time before vanishing into the fog. The next morning maids would unclasp, polish and store them away, restoring each gem to its velvet box, silent, waiting, as if the stones themselves were sighing. Another night of brilliance wasted on mortals who can't feel their toes. Because in the glittering arms race of winter luxury, warmth was temporary, but diamonds and frostbite were forever. The rich had one inviolable rule of winter. Even if the weather froze your soul, you must never smell like it. Grooming and perfume were the invisible cloaks of the upper class, their silent armour against the great enemy of refinement, the odour of humanity. Because nothing shattered the illusion of superiority faster than smelling like smoke sweat or boiled mutton. Winter made that task infinitely harder. The air was cold, the water colder, and the fireplaces filled every corner of the house with the ghostly scent of burnt coal and damp wool. While servants froze scrubbing soot from mantles, their masters faced a different horror, trying to smell divine while their bathwater turned to ice before it reached the tub. Bathing, in the traditional sense, was rare and strategic. In the early modern and Georgian periods, full immersion in water was considered dangerous, a flirtation with death, disease, or, at the very least, pneumonia. Physicians warned that bathing in winter opened the pores to wicked air, so instead the elite bathed selectively. They washed their hands, faces, and essential parts, a flexible term depending on the decade, then relied on perfume, powder, and prayer to handle the rest. Perfume was their weapon of choice, invisible, intoxicating, and proudly excessive. The wealthy treated scent the way modern influencers treat lighting, absolutely essential to the illusion. A noble entering a ballroom was expected to trail a cloud of fragrance so distinctive it could be identified before the person themselves. The goal was to smell expensive, not pleasant necessarily, but expensive. Early perfumes were concoctions of oils, herbs, and animal musk. Civet extracted from the glands of an African cat, ambergris harvested from the digestive tracts of whales, and musk sourced from deer were all staples. Each was rare, potent, and cost more than most servants' annual wages. When blended with rosewater, bergamot, or lavender, these scents became intoxicating signatures of rank. A duchess might wear a blend heavy with amber and violet, the scent of piety and possession, while a gentleman preferred something smoky and sharp like leather steeped in arrogance. The bottles themselves were miniature works of art, cut glass, gold-capped or shaped like tiny urns, lined up on dressing tables that looked like altars to vanity. Perfume was not merely applied, it was performed. A lady would dab it behind her ears, on her wrists, and, crucially, on her handkerchief, the ultimate social prop. That delicate square of embroidered linen carried her scent through every conversation, dance, and calculated swoon. If you passed a woman and her perfume lingered after her departure, she'd succeeded. If it arrived before she did, she triumphed. And perfume wasn't limited to people. The wealthy perfumed everything. Gloves were soaked in scented oils, wigs were powdered with lavender, fans were misted with rosewater. Even furniture received olfactory attention. Pomanders of cloves, cinnamon, and dried oranges hung from the rafters to mask the less noble smells of reality. Wealthy homes, therefore, didn't just look rich, they smelled rich, an atmosphere of privilege marinated in musk. But perfume alone couldn't win the war on winter odour. Grooming rituals filled the gaps where hygiene faltered. Wealthy men oiled their beards and pomaded their hair until it gleamed like lacquer. Women used scented hair powders made from starch and iris root, which turned their elaborate coiffures into fragrant snowdrifts. The powders served multiple purposes. They kept the hair looking stylish, absorbed oils, and conveniently disguised any lingering evidence of unwashed reality. The toothbrush, an invention still finding its footing, was reserved for the truly fashionable. Made with boar bristles and silver handles, it was more status symbol than sanitation tool. Toothpaste came in alarming varieties, charcoal, brick dust, and even crushed shells, but the upper classes favoured pastes laced with cinnamon or clove oil. Fresh breath, after all, was as vital as fresh scandal. Hands constantly on display were another battlefield. In winter, they suffered from cold, soot, and social expectation. Wealthy women applied balms of beeswax, almond oil, and vinegar to soften their skin. Gloves were never simply leather. They were sweet gloves, treated with rose, jasmine, or amber oil, so that even a handshake carried prestige. For gentlemen, manicured nails and perfumed pomade were as much a mark of power as a title. Still, the cold refused to cooperate. Frost-cracked dips and reddened noses, horrors that wealth couldn't tolerate. Enter the cosmetic arsenal: tinted salves, carmine rouge, and face powders mixed with lead or arsenic, because death was a small price to pay for good complexion. A perfectly powdered face that glowed under candlelight suggested refinement, even if it also suggested mild poisoning. Rouge wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda, proof that one's blood still circulated despite the frost. Grooming, in the aristocratic imagination, was moral theatre. Cleanliness, or the illusion of it, signalled control, and control was the essence of status. To appear dishevelled was to invite suspicion. If your wig was crooked, what else might be amiss? A polished exterior reflected a disciplined soul. Thus, even when the temperature indoors barely topped freezing, ladies and gentlemen spent hours before their dressing mirrors, dabbing, brushing, and scenting themselves into flawless discomfort. By nightfall, the result was astonishing. The dinner guests who emerged from their chambers glowed with candlelight, powdered to perfection and perfumed to distraction. The air around them shimmered with the mingled scents of rose, amber, tobacco, and human effort. Servants followed discreetly, fanning away the smoke from the fires that threatened to undo it all. Outside, the wind howled through chimneys and frost claimed the gardens, but inside the wealthy stood radiant, part statue, part illusion. They might not have been clean or warm or even fully conscious under all that perfume, but they were immaculate. Because in the world of winter luxury, warmth faded, wealth decayed, but scent, that invisible halo of superiority, lingered. And if your fragrance didn't reach the ballroom before you did, well, the cold certainly would. If the upper classes had one universal winter truth, it was this: the journey was never elegant, but it had to look as if it were. Travelling in the cold months wasn't simply about reaching a destination, it was about surviving the ordeal with one's dignity and digits intact. Snow, mud, and wind conspired to humiliate the unprepared. But the wealthy didn't prepare, they performed. Wrapped in cloaks, layered in pride, and armed with carriages that were part transport, part moving ego, they faced winter roads with theatrical resolve. Let's start with the carriages, the 18th and 19th century equivalent of a status update on wheels. A noble's carriage wasn't just a vehicle, it was a portable announcement that they were richer than most small nations. Polished mahogany, gilded trim, and velvet interiors were standard for the fashionable few. Each wheel squeaked in perfect rhythm with superiority. Even in blizzards, the lacquer had to gleam, which meant servants were often seen frantically brushing snow from a moving carriage, while the owner reclined inside, sipping brandy and contemplating mortality. Inside, however, luxury was often an illusion. The so-called padded interiors trapped cold like an expensive refrigerator. Foot warmers, small brass boxes filled with embers, were placed under thick blankets, their heat lasting just long enough to lull passengers into a false sense of comfort before extinguishing at the worst possible moment. Some travellers carried portable fur muffs big enough to hide their entire hands, or small lapdogs, which doubled as fashion statements and primitive space heaters. Despite all the plushness, the rich still froze elegantly. The cold didn't discriminate between the silk-lined carriage and the servant's cart. It simply found the gaps and made itself comfortable. Passengers huddled beneath cloaks made of velvet or fur, the kind of garments that announced power while doing absolutely nothing to prevent hypothermia. Ermine, sable and fox lined their collars, turning their wearers into moving menageries of vanity. Still, when the wind howled through the cracks, even an earl could end up shivering like a footman. Speaking of footmen, the true martyrs of winter travel see it. They rode outside. While their masters nestled in half-frozen luxury, these unfortunate souls perched on the rear step of the carriage, gripping iron rails and praying the frostbite would only claim unimportant fingers. The driver, meanwhile, faced the storm head-on, his face red and chapped, his breath crystallizing before his eyes. Wrapped in rough wool and animal skins, he looked less like a professional coachman and more like a snow-covered monument to endurance. By the time they reached their destination, the noble inside might murmur, "A touch brisk, isn't it?" while the driver quietly wondered if his ears were still attached. Roads in winter were another ordeal entirely, half skating rink, half mud bath. The Great North Road, that proud artery of British travel, could turn overnight into a slush apocalypse. Wheels froze, horses slipped, and carriages overturned with embarrassing frequency. But such hazards rarely discouraged the wealthy. They simply rebranded disaster as adventure. A minor crash became an invigorating incident. Spending the night in a roadside inn was a rustic diversion. If the carriage lost a wheel in a snowdrift, the owner might simply send a servant to fetch help while composing an anecdote about the charming unpredictability of travel. Carriages themselves evolved to handle the cold, or at least pretend to. The winter coach often came with interior padding, fur trimmings, and glass windows to block the wind. Wealthier travellers even commissioned custom sleigh carriages for snowy estates, complete with jingling bells and painted panels depicting heroic myths, because if you were going to risk frostbite, you might as well look mythical doing it. The sleigh ride became a courtship cliché, gliding through moonlit snow, breath visible, hearts fluttering and noses going completely numb. For shorter journeys, there were sedan chairs, the aristocrats' answer to, "What if Uber?" but with servants and suffering. Two bearers carried the enclosed chair through icy streets, slipping occasionally on cobblestones while the occupant reclined inside, insulated by fur, perfume and detachment. It was the height of convenience, assuming one didn't mind being carried like luggage through a blizzard by two human popsicles. Arriving at one's destination was its own social ritual. Guests were expected to emerge from their carriage looking composed, no matter how many frost-bitten minutes they just endured. Servants rushed forward with lanterns and cloaks, while the host pretended not to notice the icicles forming on everyone's eyebrows. A proper lady never complained of cold, she simply declared the air refreshing. A gentleman, meanwhile, took pride in shaking snow from his hat as if brushing off the mere inconvenience rather than hypothermia. And then there was the matter of timing. Punctuality was a virtue, but so was drama. The fashionably late entrance, carriage wheels crunching over frozen gravel just as the candles were lit, became an art form. Too early and you look desperate. Too late and you risk scandal. But arriving precisely 15 minutes after everyone else, that was mastery. The frost on your cloak sparkled, your cheeks glowed with genuine suffering, and every guest turned to admire your dedication to aesthetic misery. The return journey, however, stripped away all pretences. After the laughter, the dancing, and the endless courses of food, guests piled back into their carriages with the grim resignation of condemned aristocrats. The embers in the foot-warmers had long since died, the brandy flasks were empty, and conversation dwindled to muttered complaints about the temperature. Outside, the driver cracked his whip and braced for another round of wind burn. Inside, the noble passengers huddled in silence, faces illuminated by moonlight and mild regret. Winter travel, for all its grandeur, was equal parts ordeal and theatre, a performance of control over chaos. Every mile was a test of endurance wrapped in etiquette. every arrival a declaration that even nature must yield to nobility's schedule. Because for the rich, arriving alive was expected, but arriving stylishly on time and only partially frozen, that was class. No one celebrated the cold quite like the rich, mostly because they could afford to pretend it wasn't trying to kill them. And nowhere was this delusion more spectacularly staged than at the winter ball. That glittering contradiction where guests in silk gowns danced beneath chandeliers while their breath hung visibly in the air. It was a night of elegance, endurance, and enthusiastic denial, a social sauna frozen solid. To host a winter ball was the ultimate declaration of wealth. It wasn't just an evening of diversion, it was a public statement of vitality. While lesser households huddled by the hearth, the elite flung open their frostbitten doors and declared, "Let there be dancing and pneumonia." The invitations, often gilded and delivered by a liveried footman, set the tone. Carriages at 10, dancing till dawn, frost optional, influenza complimentary, yes. The venue was a marvel of contradiction. The ballroom itself, vast and echoing, was rarely designed for warmth. High ceilings trapped heat somewhere near the rafters, while the marble floors turned guests' toes into tiny monuments of suffering. The air smelled of beeswax, perfume, and ambition. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting soft light that disguised blue lips as romantic pallor. At first glance, the scene was breathtaking. Rows of women glittering in silk and tulle, their shoulders bare in defiance of reason, their jewels throwing light like captive stars. Gentlemen stood resplendent in the tailored coats, starched cravats, and expressions of mild regret. Musicians tuned their instruments in a corner, huddled close enough to the fireplace to risk spontaneous combustion, while servants discreetly replaced extinguished candles before darkness could expose the frost creeping along the walls. The evening always began with entrance theatre. Guests descended grand staircases as though gliding through a painting, smiling through teeth that were already regretting exposure to the air. Cloaks were whisked away by a footman, revealing gowns that cost as much as carriages and offered about as much insulation as a cobweb. Applause followed the host's first entrance, part admiration, part acknowledgement that anyone who could afford to heat even half this room deserved recognition. Then came the dancing, the true spectacle. Waltzes, quadrilles, and minuets filled the floor, each step measured, each twirl rehearsed. The music soared, couples spun, and the temperature paradoxically dropped. The effort of movement produced warmth, yes, but every open window, kept ajar to prevent candle smoke from suffocating the elite, ensured that no one's comfort lasted long. The combination of sweat and icy draughts created what doctors might diplomatically call a fine breeding ground for chest complaints. And yet romance thrived, or at least the illusion of it did. Candlelight softened floors, wine softened judgment, and everyone was too cold to think clearly. Gloved hands met in polite contact, eyes locked across frozen air, and hearts fluttered beneath layers of corsetry and frostbite. "She glowed," one admirer might write afterward, admitting that the glow came partly from fever. The fashion of the ball demanded that women's shoulders and necklines remain bare, no matter the weather. Fashionable ladies wore gowns that defied logic and insulation alike. To appear bundled up was to commit social suicide. Goosebumps were the price of beauty. Frostbite was simply enthusiasm gone too far. Gentlemen, for their part, endured equally in silence, their tight wool coats and breeches offering minimal warmth against marble floors that radiated all the charm of a tomb. Between dances, guests refreshed themselves with wine, sherbet, and gossip. The refreshments table was a battlefield of etiquette, delicate spoons clinking in chilled punch bowls, slices of preserved fruit glittering like jewels. The irony of serving ice cream during a snowstorm was lost on no one but the host. After all, luxury meant doing the least sensible thing in the most expensive way possible. As the night deepened, the air grew hazy from smoke, perfume, and human endurance. Candles burned low, their wax pooling like exhausted ambition. The orchestra's tempo quickened as the wine flowed, and polite conversation began to slur into laughter. A duchess might complain of faintness, translation, too much port. A young heir might declare undying love to the nearest warm object, and at least one guest inevitably slipped on the dance floor, to be remembered forever as spirited. Servants, of course, endured their own waltz of misery. While the guests twirled above, maids and footmen scurried through icy corridors below, stoking fires that could never quite win. The kitchen filled with steam, sweat and curses, while upstairs the glittering elite toasted their own resilience against the season. The servants weren't fooled. They knew that half those smiles were just attempts to hide shivering. The ball often ended sometime before dawn, partly because the candles burned out, partly because the guests did. Carriages lined the frosted drive, horses snorting clouds into the air, drivers stamping their feet to stay conscious. Inside, the departing ladies and gentlemen bundled into their cloaks, cheeks flushed, eyes glazed, and lungs filled with equal parts champagne and cold air. The final toast rang through the hallway. "Splendid evening! So invigorating, you look radiant, positively feverish." The aftermath was as predictable as the dancing. The next morning half the guests took to their beds with coughs, headaches and symptoms that would later be labelled the fashionable influenza. Doctors made small fortunes prescribing brandy rest and moral restraint, latter of course being the least popular cure. And yet, despite the casualties, the winter ball always returned. Because for the rich, it wasn't truly about dancing or even pleasure, it was about visibility. To be seen, admired and envied beneath 1,000 flickering candles was worth every sneeze and every scandal. Illness could be hidden, irrelevance could not. So they kept dancing, silk sweeping over marble, diamonds glinting like fireflies in frost. The cold might have numbed their fingers and lungs, but not their vanity, because in the grand theatre of winter society, love might fade, and warmth might flee. But influenza was eternal, and glamour survived everything else. In the hierarchy of winter survival, the wealthy were both the best dressed and the least prepared to live. The frost may have spared no one, but it certainly looked more spectacular when it struck silk, velvet and powdered wigs. Among the nobility, fashion wasn't protection, it was performance, and every performance demanded suffering. The poor froze because they had no choice. The rich froze because they had taste. The cold season was the ultimate test of commitment to elegance. For the elite, every winter outing, from carriage rides to evening balls, became a kind of high-stakes runway. The unwritten rule was clear. Comfort was common, and common was fatal to reputation. To bundle up was to surrender one's social identity. The fashionable noble faced frostbite with the same resolve soldiers faced battle. One fought for glory, the other for compliments. Consider the 18th century socialite trusting corset, silk gown, and powdered hair that could house a small family of birds. Her décolletage was heroically exposed to the elements, her shoulders dusted in glittering jewels that glowed all the brighter against gooseflesh. When the ballroom's temperature plummeted, she didn't ask for a shawl, she asked for more rouge. To look flushed, she said, is to look alive. It was the cosmetic equivalent of denial, and society adored it. Gentlemen were no less suicidal in their dedication. Tight breeches, silk waistcoats, and polished shoes offered the same thermal protection as a polite cough. Cloaks existed, of course, but wearing one for too long indoors was seen as an offence to taste, a sign you valued circulation over presentation. Even gloves were thin, designed to show off well-manicured hands rather than to preserve fingers. It was a world where style was armour, and armour was decorative at best. The result? Frostbite, chilblains and pneumonia became the true accessories of the upper class. Physicians of the period, those who weren't too polite to say it aloud, recorded endless cases of cold humours and numb afflictions of the extremities. The fashionable lady might lose a fingertip and call it a seasonal inconvenience. A gentleman might limp through a ball blaming the gout, when the real culprit was a shoe frozen stiff from the carriage ride. The more fragile your constitution, the more poetic your suffering appeared. The phrase delicate health became code for looked amazing but nearly died. Even outerwear, that bastion of warmth, was designed more for drama than defence. Cloaks and capes billowed like theatrical curtains, trimmed in fur and embroidery but offering no insulation to speak of. They were cut to flow, not to close. A well-dressed noble stepping out of a carriage might look magnificent as their cloak caught the wind, but beneath their knees were knocking like castanets. The colder the night, the grander the silhouette. It was less dressing for the weather, and more challenging the weather to a duel. The hair situation didn't help either. Wigs, powdered, perfumed, and towering, acted like personal snowdrifts. They absorbed moisture from the cold air, froze slightly, and then shed powder like dandruff from a frosty deity. Men's wigs fared no better. Many aristocrats had to thaw their hairpieces beside fires before dinner, and yet removing a wig in public was a greater scandal than losing one's toes. Dignity came before digits. As the 19th century dawned, one might expect sense to prevail. It did not. The Victorians, ever devoted to appearances, simply shifted the battlefield. Ladies wore crinoline skirts wide enough to trap draughts and hoop frames that turned into miniature wind tunnels when crossing courtyards. Petticoats layered like architectural blueprints provided weight, but not warmth. A single gust could turn an outing into a near-death experience wrapped in taffeta. The ideal woman was pale, graceful, and visibly fragile. In other words, someone who looked like she'd fainted artistically in a snowbank. Men didn't escape winter vanity either. The Victorian gentleman's coat, long, tailored, and lined with more pride than padding, was worn open to display waistcoat and watch chain. Hats perched precariously on pomaded hair, ensuring that wind and frost had maximum opportunity to punish the vain. The dashing look of a slightly windblown collar was all the rage, achieved at the small price of bronchitis. And let's not forget the footwear follies. Shoes were notoriously thin-soled and absurdly decorative, made for parquet floors rather than icy streets. Heels cracked, silk slippers soaked through instantly, and gentlemen's polished boots offered no traction. The sound of winter in Mayfair or Versailles wasn't just the clatter of carriages. It was the faint, tragic squeak of rich people slipping on frozen cobblestones, while insisting everything was perfectly charming. Still, the frost had its uses. Pale skin and red cheeks, natural signs of hypothermia, were fashionable beauty standards. The winter complexion was praised in poetry and portraits, that faintly glassy-eyed look that said, "I'm either in love or losing circulation." Servants sometimes pinched their mistress's cheeks before public appearances to produce the right shade of near-death radiance. Rouge helped too, but nature's touch was always preferred, even if it came with fever. To outsiders, it all looked absurd, and perhaps it was. But among the upper crust, the cold became part of the mythology of refinement. The ability to stand motionless in a draughty ballroom, smiling while icicles formed on your eyelashes, proved you were more than human. You were elevated. Fashion wasn't meant to protect the body. It was meant to elevate it above such petty concerns. Of course, some learned this the hard way. Diaries and letters from the era record countless tales of nobles collapsing mid-season from the chill after weeks of public appearances in silk and satin. Doctors prescribed warm wine, poultices, or, in dire cases, staying home, a cure that most patients heroically ignored. Because what was the point of wealth if you couldn't risk your health displaying it? And so, winter after winter, the rich continued their icy parade, cloaked, perfumed, glittering and slightly frostbitten. Their portraits survived, serene and beautiful, giving no hint that the subjects were probably numb from the neck down when they sat for them. Because in the theatre of high society, frostbite wasn't a failure, it was a fashion statement. And if you didn't nearly die looking fabulous, well, were you ever really part of the elite? While the rich sipped mulled wine and congratulated themselves on surviving another charmingly chilly season, their servants were the ones actually battling winter. and losing. Every glowing hearth upstairs was paid for in sweat, soot, and a few minor cases of frostbite downstairs. The upper classes toasted warmth with silver cups. The staff earned it one freezing bucket at a time. If the rich lived in palaces of privilege, the servants lived in drafty endurance tests tucked just out of sight. The contrast was criminal. Upstairs, fires crackled in marble hearths. Downstairs, the air could be cold enough to preserve meat. Servants' quarters were deliberately placed far from luxury, high in attics, low in basements, or wedged beside storage rooms, anywhere that would keep them invisible and inexpensive to heat. The result was architectural cruelty disguised as hierarchy. When frost coated the windows, the masters called it a picturesque winter morning. The servants called it Wednesday. Attics, where many maids and footmen slept, were the true Arctic frontier. Roof tiles rattled in the wind, snow seeped through the slates, and ice grew along the walls like decorative punishment. Blankets were thin, often shared, and the bed frame was usually a splintered board designed more to humble than to support. In some houses, the servants placed hot bricks under their sheets, a fleeting luxury that lasted about 15 minutes before cooling into regret. They slept in layers of uniform, shawl and exhaustion, often too cold to remove their shoes. Basement servants fared little better. Kitchens, sculleries, and pantries were ovens by day and ice boxes by night. The very fires that roasted dinners left behind coal dust and chill, as heat escaped through the chimneys to warm rooms they'd never see. Scullery maids, perpetually damp from washing dishes in freezing water, were expected to rise before dawn and plunge their hands into basins that could double as glacial experiments. Character building, or the upper classes called it. Torture with crockery, the maids replied silently. Then there were the coal duties, the Sisyphean task of feeding fires that never slept. In a large country house, maintaining warmth was a full-time military campaign. Every hearth required constant attention, every grate needed ash removal, and every corridor demanded fuel transport. Coal scuttles, weighed more than some of the footmen who carried them. By the time the upstairs fire blazed to the master's satisfaction, the servant who lit it was already sweating through frost. And when the coal stores ran low, they trudged to the yard, through sleet, mud, and social invisibility to fetch more. Footmen, valets, and housemaids became human heating systems, running from room to room with glowing embers and no gloves. Their work began before dawn, when their breath misted in the still air of the corridors, and ended long after midnight, when the final candle sputtered out in the drawing room. The only warmth they ever felt was borrowed, fleeting draughts of firelight caught while passing through. The irony was exquisite. They lived to keep others warm, and froze in gratitude. Servants also had the pleasure of laundry day, a winter ritual designed by someone who clearly hated humanity. Washing required hauling buckets of icy water, scrubbing linen by hand, and then drying it in rooms that barely qualified as rooms. The damp never left the walls or their lungs. Many developed chronic coughs, politely referred to as housemaid's chest. A doctor might recommend rest, which was about as realistic as recommending flight. Meals were another testament to suffering. While the family dined on roasts and tip puddings upstairs, the staff subsisted on what could be spared or recycled. Bread hardened in hours, butter congealed into brick, and tea cooled before it hit the cup. Yet somehow they were expected to appear cheerful. Singing servants were considered good servants, even if the song was the only thing vibrating. Their clothing too was a study in contradiction. Uniforms were designed to look neat, not to preserve life. Housemaids wore thin cotton dresses and aprons in houses that felt like refrigerators. The butler might have a thicker coat, but he was required to remove it before appearing before guests, because warmth was unseemly. The gardeners, stable hands, and coachmen at least had movement on their side, but that only helped until the sleet set in. Many wore straw stuffed in their boots for insulation, an innovation more practical than anything the nobility ever invented. And yet the hierarchy demanded grace. Servants were expected to curtsy, smile, and speak in measured tones no matter how numb their faces were. Complaining was frowned upon, sneezing was practically mutiny. The phrase serving with good cheer was less a compliment and more a threat. Even when frost bloomed on their pillows, the staff remained outwardly dutiful, powered by pride, necessity, and a quiet, enduring resentment that could have heated an entire manor. Occasionally small rebellions warmed the soul. A maid might linger an extra moment near the kitchen fire, risking reprimand for idleness. A footman might take the longest route possible when delivering coal, purely for the thrill of thawing his hands. Even the cook, half drowned in steam, might slip an extra crust of warm bread to a scullery maid with the solemnity of a priest granting absolution. These tiny mercies were their real fuel, far more sustaining than coal. And while the masters slept soundly in feathered comfort, the servants climbed back into their frozen beds. The fires they tended burned high upstairs, but none of that warmth ever reached the attic rafters. In those dark hours, the house split cleanly in two. Above, opulence. Below, endurance. The frost pressed against both windows equally. Only one side could afford to ignore it. But for all the cold, one thing truly did keep the servants warm. The quiet, simmering satisfaction of knowing that without them, the rich would be just as frozen as everyone else, only far less capable of lighting their own fires. Because in the end, resentment burns hotter than coal, and lasts a good deal longer too. In the social calendar of the wealthy, winter house parties, which was supposed to be about refinement, charm, and seasonal generosity, a few days of dinner, laughter, and shared warmth before everyone retreated back to their respective estates. Unfortunately, they were also the aristocratic equivalent of inviting a hurricane to tea and discovering it had packed luggage. Once the snow fell and the fires were lit, the upper classes discovered a universal truth. Guests, like frost, were easy to welcome but impossible to get rid of. The wealthy prided themselves on hospitality, or at least on being seen as hospitable. When December rolled in, so did the invitations, cousins from Bath, baronets from Kent, widows between houses, and that one charming poet who never paid rent. All appeared on doorsteps with trunks, gratitude, and absolutely no intention of leaving before spring. The polite phrase, "come stay a while," was treated less as courtesy and more as a legally binding agreement. Once installed, these guests settled into the manor like decorative mould. They occupied the best bedrooms, monopolised the fires, and turned a pleasant Christmas visit into a seasonal occupation. In an age before central heating, a heated home was the true luxury, and a wealthy friend with one was better than a fur coat. Guests who arrived just before the snow often lingered through January because of the weather, then through February because the roads were dreadful, and finally until March, when they could reasonably claim to be waiting for the thaw. The hosts, trapped by politeness, endured their presence like saints performing penance in brocade. Social etiquette forbade any direct suggestion of departure. To say, "When will you be leaving?" was considered ruder than smallpox. Instead, subtle hints were dropped, mentioning the end of the firewood supply, reminiscing aloud about how empty the house feels once guests are gone, or casually having the servants begin packing the visitors' belongings for airing. None of it worked. The winter guest was immune to both shame and metaphor. These seasonal squatters came in types. There was the melancholic widow, eternally sighing by the fire and insisting the cold reminded her of dear departed Edmund. There was the social peacock, who commandeered the drawing-room piano nightly and filled the house with his rendition of Handel badly. The practical cousin who helped in the kitchen, only to disrupt it. The ailing aunt who required an entire wing and 3 servants to attend her imaginary illnesses. And of course the charming friend of a friend who somehow forgot to ever leave a forwarding address. The burden wasn't only physical, it was logistical. More guests meant more fires to stoke, more sheets to launder, and more mouths to feed in a season when fresh food was already scarce. Servants muttered darkly as they hauled yet another scuttle of coal upstairs for someone who refused to leave their bed until noon. The kitchen became a battleground of patience and pastry. The cook, expected to conjure miracles from dwindling supplies, often fantasized about serving boiled shoe leather as country fare. And then came the evening routines, those endless winter entertainments that turned hospitality into theatre. Every night required something new: card games, musicales, impromptu poetry readings, charades that refused to die. The same guests who complained about drafts somehow had the energy to perform Shakespeare badly until 2 a.m. The host smiled through gritted teeth, while the hostess considered the tragic convenience of an unshoveled walkway. Worse still, the longer guests stayed, the more they behaved like homeowners. They rearranged furniture for better light, requested specific dishes, and critiqued the household's management with the confidence of auditors. One visiting baronet reportedly instructed his host's butler on how to stack logs more symmetrically. Another guest was discovered napping in the library, in the host's chair, wearing the host's slippers, and insisting it was all in the spirit of friendship. Departure was always dramatic and temporary. The same guests who had stayed 3 months would weep at leaving, promising to return soon, which everyone knew meant sooner than desired. Their carriages would finally creak down the frosty lane, the sound fading like deliverance, and for a brief, blissful moment the house would be silent. Servants sighed, hosts collapsed, and someone inevitably discovered the guest had forgotten half their luggage, ensuring a reason to return. Even letters couldn't protect one from the migratory elite. In winter, correspondence became a weapon of invasion. "How I long for your company in these dreary months," one might write, meaning, "I hope your firewood supply can handle me and my lapdog." The only defence was feigned illness or non-existent renovations. Some hosts fled to London preemptively, leaving their country estates under repair until April, all to avoid becoming unwilling landlords of friendship. The psychology of it all was simple. Winter bred dependency. Travel was slow, the outdoors impassable, and solitude unbearable. Visiting someone richer became both practical and pleasurable. If you were clever enough, you could ride out the entire season under another's roof, warm, fed, and surrounded by servants who secretly despised you. The trick was to call it enduring the cold together. For the host, the ordeal only ended when the snow did. As crocuses pushed through thawing soil and birds remembered their songs, the final guests began to stir. They stretched, sighed, and declared, "What a lovely stay. I do hope we haven't been too much trouble." The proper response, of course, was not at all. Though the proper feeling was, "You've consumed my firewood, my patience, and 3 months of my life." And as their carriages finally disappeared down the lane, the house felt like heaven again, silent, empty, and gloriously cold. Fires burned lower, servants breathed freely, and the hosts rejoiced in temporary solitude. But deep down, they knew. The next frost would bring the next knock at the door, another round of smiling siege warfare disguised as social grace. Because in the world of winter luxury, hospitality was holy, but deliverance only came when the last guest's shadow vanished from the drive. After months of ice, smoke, and collective denial, spring didn't arrive. It ambushed. One morning, the frost seemed a little thinner. A drip echoed from the eaves, then another. Within days, the world that had been white, silent, and beautiful in a deadly sort of way turned into a soggy apocalypse of optimism. The great thaw was less a season and more a reckoning. Everything the cold had politely preserved, mud, manure, secrets, came roaring back to life. The pristine snow that had glittered under moonlight now melted into slush so thick it could swallow a boot, a carriage, or a small child. Streets once solid with ice transformed into rivers of filth. For the poor it was a muddy miracle. For the rich it was an inconvenience that smelled like democracy. Inside grand homes, the first thaw wasn't met with joy but dread. As temperatures rose, so did the stink. All winter long, the cold had suppressed odours, the smoky breath of coal fires, the damp wood, the lingering perfume of humanity. Now, those scents reawakened. Drawing rooms began to smell faintly like wet dog and forgotten dinners. Carpets soaked up condensation, and walls sweated with relief. Mays opened windows that hadn't budged in months, unleashing both fresh air and a torrent of sneezes from those unaccustomed to actual ventilation. For servants, spring cleaning wasn't a tradition. It was revenge of the frost. Every hearth had to be scraped, every drape beaten, every rug dragged outside to be thrashed within an inch of its existence. The soot of an entire season came loose in choking clouds. Upstairs, the masters sighed about how invigorating it must be to clean, while downstairs, the staff briefly considered rebellion. Feather dusters became weapons, buckets sloshed, and no matter how grand the house, the smell of vinegar and effort filled the air. But even amid the chaos, something wonderful happened. Colour returned. The landscape, once painted entirely in shades of grey despair, slowly came back to life. Gardens that had spent months impersonating graveyards began to stir. Snowdrops pushed through the slush like tiny white flags of surrender, followed by crocuses, daffodils, and hope. The gentry, who had spent the winter indoors perfecting their complexions to resemble candle wax, cautiously emerged, blinking at sunlight as if it were an unexpected guest. The change in wardrobe alone was a revelation. Heavy velvets and furs were packed away, often with relief so sincere it bordered on prayer. Silk gowns fluttered back into rotation, pastel shades replacing the funereal tones of January. Gentlemen abandoned their cloaks and gloves and took to strolling outdoors again, mostly to prove they hadn't lost circulation. Every thaw brought its own new epidemic of seasonal enthusiasm, that mix of elation, sneezing, and mild disbelief that humans could once again exist without 4 layers of wool. Yet the thaw also revealed everything winter had kindly hidden. Streets, for example, became archaeological sites of horror. Layers of ice melted to expose months of accumulated filth, soot, refuse, and unidentifiable items that had once been alive. City dwellers picked their way through puddles that looked suspiciously sentient. In towns like London or Paris, open sewers flowed freely again, perfuming the spring air with odour of grey. The elite, naturally, fled to the countryside to breathe the clean air, leaving servants behind to disinfect what civilization had thawed. Country estates fared no better. Lawns turned to bogs, gardens drowned, and carriages sank axle-deep in mud. Horses refused to leave the stables, and the stables themselves smelled like nature's protest. Yet even amid this swamp of inconvenience, optimism bloomed. The thaw meant new life, lambs bleating, farmers planting, and wealthy landowners congratulating themselves on the beauty of renewal without, of course, touching any of it. Spring also signalled the return of social mobility, and unfortunately visitors. After months trapped indoors, everyone suddenly remembered everyone else. Invitations multiplied like rabbits. "We must dine soon" became the rallying cry of the thawed elite. Country families planned garden parties on lawns still half swamp, while city dwellers dusted off carriages that hadn't moved since Christmas. The rich resumed their seasonal migrations, to London for the season, to Bath for the waters, or to anyone else's estate with better plumbing. The thaw also revived the economy of appearances. Portrait painters, idle through the dark months, were summoned to capture the glow of spring. Dressmakers worked overtime creating lighter fashions, even as the weather remained vindictive. Perfumers, long out of business thanks to the dominance of smoke and stew smells, hawked new scents like Morning Meadow and Thaw's Delight, which ironically smelled nothing like either. Of course, the thaw had its hazards. Roofs leaked, rivers flooded. The snow that had insulated entire villages now melted into torrents that swept away fences, gardens, and optimism. But society treated even disaster as a season's novelty. Newspapers published poetic accounts of spring's grand cleansing, conveniently ignoring that half the countryside was knee-deep in sludge. And yet, despite all the mess, people smiled again. The first truly warm day felt like a miracle, an apology from nature for everything it had put them through. Servants hung laundry that actually dried, Children escaped into the muddy outdoors, and even the aristocracy managed to look mildly sincere while praising the renewal of God's creation. The cold months became a badge of survival, something to boast about over tea. Ah, yes, that terrible frost, but one does grow stronger for it. Don't you think? Translation: I still can't feel my toes, but at least I can open a window. By the time crocuses lined the walkways and birds did sing again, the long, glittering misery of winter had finally melted into memory. The house creaked with life instead of frost. Fires burned lower, windows opened wider, and the smell of damp wood gave way to fresh air and the occasional whiff of manure. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Spring didn't erase winter's hardships. It simply forgave them in colour. And as sunlight warmed the faces of the same nobles who'd nearly frozen for fashion, everyone agreed that it had been a most invigorating season. After all, to admit they'd hated winter would have ruined the narrative, and there's nothing the upper class feared more than an honest story. Time, as it often does, performed its greatest trick on winter. It made it beautiful. The same season that once left people shivering, coughing, and covered in soot was reborn in paintings and poetry as a golden, glittering age of hearth and heart. The cold that once cracked skin and froze water barrels was reinvented as something picturesque. The soft, sentimental freeze of nostalgia, where everyone looked like they'd spent the season gracefully reading by candlelight rather than fighting off pneumonia. Once the fires went out and the frost thawed, memory did what memory always does. It edited. The smoke stains vanished, the chilblains were forgotten, and the endless drudgery of hauling coal was recast as domestic charm. Winter, once an ordeal of survival, became a backdrop for beauty. The great irony of history is that the very people who cursed the cold while living through it later immortalised it in glowing, misty tones. In the paintings of the 18th and 19th centuries, winter became a stage for romance and virtue. Artists filled canvases with rosy-cheeked figures skating elegantly on frozen ponds, their scarves fluttering in the wind. Nobody fell, nobody froze, and absolutely nobody smelled of coal smoke. Villages glowed beneath sugar-white snow, chimneys puffed like with cheerful exhalations, and every cottage window shimmered with the golden promise of comfort. Never mind that the reality involved frostbitten feet, mouldy bread and smoke inhalation, nostalgia painted in warm tones. Victorian artists in particular were masters of this selective remembering. Their paintings and Christmas cards transformed the season into a moral tableau. Snow-covered streets filled with charity, laughter and glowing shop fronts. Charles Dickens did it too. His London was a place where snow fell politely, and poor families discovered joy through the power of goose dinners and redemption. He gave winter a soul, and it was conveniently middle class. Viewers and readers could sigh over the hardships of the season without ever smelling the slush or stepping in it. Even aristocratic memory polished its own frostbitten history. The same nobles who once complained of draughty halls later spoke fondly of the splendid winters of our youth. Fires that had smoked them half-blind were recalled as grand blazes. The endless noise of servants hauling fuel became the cosy bustle of a well-run home. The cold bedrooms of their childhoods were remembered as invigorating, the kind of word only the elderly or the dishonest use about freezing to death. Poets naturally made matters worse. They gave winter a personality, wistful, noble, and gently tragic. Snow became the silent muse, frost the sculptor of the fields, and chimneys the poets of the poor. No one wrote odes to chilblains, or sonnets about trying to light damp coal at dawn. Instead, the cold was turned into metaphor, for purity, for reflection, for the fleeting beauty of life itself. A poet could wax lyrical about the crystalline silence of winter, mainly because they were writing it from a heated study with brandy in hand. This transformation from misery to myth served a purpose. The wealthy used nostalgia to recast discomfort as virtue. Their ancestors' struggles became proof of hardier times. conveniently ignoring that their ancestors had the same complaints. To romanticize the freeze was to moralize it. We were tougher then, they'd say, sipping tea beside their new radiators. We endured the elements with grace. Of course, grace meant wearing diamonds in a draft while servants worked themselves into pneumonia downstairs, but memory doesn't care for detail. The newly industrialized cities also joined in the illusion. Once coal and gas heating took hold, the Victorians began to miss the very thing they'd spent decades trying to escape. "Ah, the simplicity of the old hearth," they cried, forgetting the soot that blackened lungs and walls alike. Artists painted sentimental scenes of hearthside families, the firelight glowing on contented faces. You'd never guess those same hearths once caused half the nation's respiratory issues. By the late 19th century, even advertisements for coal depicted it as comfort incarnate, the very thing it had once burned from their throats. Writers and painters weren't the only culprits. Photographers too captured the frost as beauty, not burden. Early winter photography, with its long exposures and grainy charm, turned cold landscapes into ethereal visions. Ice became lace, mist became poetry, and the human misery just outside the frame conveniently evaporated. The world looked silent, holy, and harmless, the opposite of what it actually was. By the turn of the 20th century, the myth of the cosy winter was complete. Christmas had become its crown jewel, a season of warmth, family, and goodwill, scrubbed clean of its earlier grime. Songs praised the snow, stories celebrated the hearth, and everyone pretended that the great frost of memory had always been kind. People who once cursed January now decorated postcards with glittering frost patterns, blissfully unaware that their grandparents would have sold a toe for proper insulation. Memory, after all, doesn't preserve, it curates. It keeps the shimmer and discards the smoke. The crackle of fire remains, but not the sting of ash. The snow glows white, never grey. Nostalgia, with its soft brush, repaints the bitter chill into something bearable, even beautiful. The frost that once bit now merely kissed. The wind that howled now whispered. The world, rewritten in recollection, looks far kinder than it ever was. And that's the final comfort of history. It doesn't need to be true, only flattering. The same people who once shivered in fur and silk later told their grandchildren how magical it all had been. Pain becomes poetry, soot becomes charm, and the long, freezing nights transform into candlelit legends. Because memory is the best insulator of all. It keeps you warm, but only because it quietly burns the truth.